Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf 2.0, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku's Guilt Turned into Power? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Ochako Uraraka had been having a perfect day. Well, perfect at least by her standards. It had all begun as an average school day, but soon escalated into a far more exciting event over the course of the beginning of the class's morning routine. Aizawa had explained to the class that students in possession of provisional licenses were to be given a rare opportunity to operate without the constant supervision of a professional hero out in the field for a single day. The class would be divided into groups based on student choice, each heading to a different area to patrol. They were instructed, of course, only to deal with tasks of a nature that students could handle, and in the situation that anything serious or truly threatening occurred, they were required to call a superior and run from the sight of danger rather than engage any serious villains. Though this sort of exercise would normally be frowned upon by both the school board and local system of law enforcement, both had struck a deal with these conditions under the presumption that the experience would give the students valuable lessons in teamwork and citizen communication. Uraraka knew this was also partially because of the recent all-time low in local crime that had been ushered in after the fall of the Yakuza. It wasn't exactly revolutionary, but it seemed safe enough as of late to allow students to act more freely. Izuku and Ida had paired with Uraraka almost automatically due to their friendship, and Todoroki, Uraraka suspected, had joined soon afterwards due to the presence of Izuku. Though Uraraka had expected Bakugo to join up with Mina, Jairu, Kirishima, and Kaminari, he had also surprisingly followed Todoroki's suit, claiming that he had to make sure Deku didn't screw things up. Though Uraraka didn't object, she was certainly annoyed at the blonde boy's brazen attitude. After all, Izuku was much less likely to ruin social interactions than his fiery counterpart, and he had received his provisional license a full month after Izuku. Yet even Bakugo's presence wasn't enough to dampen her good mood. Uraraka was thrilled at the idea of helping others and getting true on-the-job experience, even if it wasn't of as heroic of a nature as she had originally hoped. So far her group had helped a child locate her lost cat, stopped a small personal fight between two teenagers in front of a convenience store, and helped an old woman out of her crashed car. Though none of the incidents had been anything to write home about, or even real hero work, Ida and Izuku had obviously been very proud of the day's accomplishments. Both boys had had infectious grins on their faces after each task, and of course both of them never failed to charm the people they helped. Their determination and dedication to even insignificant work inspired Uraraka to try her best as well. Todoroki had taken on a somewhat apathetic attitude through the exercise, but didn't seem to necessarily dislike it. Uraraka had even seen him stifle grins for each of Izuku's bright smiles, and the brunette was beginning to believe that Todoroki found the mood just as contagious as she did. Bakugo, however. Every time the group took on a task, Bakugo would immediately rush to the forefront, placing himself as the leader of the group. Then, despite his initial readiness to deal with problems, he would act exasperated when he realized the smallness of their scope. Though his assertion was subtle, it was grating after a while, and though Izuku took it silently, Todoroki had glared at Bakugo on multiple occasions. If looks could kill, Todoroki would have already committed first-degree murder. But of course even that was endurable with Ida present to play the role of moderator. Whenever things seemed to get out of hand, he would calm the others down with a dramatic speech, and tensions would die down quickly either from Bakugo's evident boredom or Izuku's endorsement of his classmates' messages. Currently the five were simply walking down the sidewalk, having not seen a disturbance in some time, though Todoroki seemed oddly on edge. Looking around, Uraraka realized that none of her peers had noticed the silent boy's obvious discomfort, as Bakugo was currently trying to pick a fight with a less than willing Izuku. "Stop smiling like that, dubass," the blonde blurted, arms crossed over his chest. "You don't have a single thing to be proud of. Even as a team we only managed to complete some worthless busywork." Izuku merely nodded in response, a wide grin still plastered across his face. "I know. But it still feels good to contribute, doesn't it? You saw how grateful that girl was when we returned her cat." This kind of work is exactly what it means to be a hero. Helping others even when it isn't public or flashy. Bakugo frowned begrudgingly. True, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worthless. After all, that kid would have found the cat on her own anyways. It was literally only a few feet away. This isn't the kind of thing I need to be devoting my time to when I could be doing real training. This can hardly be considered a challenge at all. There he goes again. Uraraka mused inwardly, rolling her eyes. He's still too stubborn to admit that Izuku's right. At this point Uraraka could already determine the trajectory of the conversation and began to naturally tune the two boys out, instead heading over to question the still shaken-looking Todoroki. She sidled up to the boy slowly, afraid he wouldn't want to talk to her. After all, the two hardly interacted in class, and the only thing really holding them together was their mutual respect of Izuku. Luckily for the pink-clad girl, however, Todoroki made the first move. "Uraraka, have you noticed what part of town we're in?" he asked, a sharp edge creeping into his voice. Now that he mentioned it, Uraraka hadn't exactly been paying attention to the group's location. Similarly to the others, she had been much more focused on the small squabbles and constant conversation rather than the writing on nearby signs. However, now that she thought about it, the streets had been desolate for quite some ways, and most shops in the area were boarded up or otherwise vacant. "No, but you've got a point. This is very unsettling." The young girl shuddered as she surveyed the scene before her. It suddenly felt as though eyes were boring into the back of head, and she wanted nothing more than to be back on the main streets of the usually bustling area. Todoroki shook his head, his eyes darting around as if to search for hidden threats. "It's not just the general lack of people that's disturbing. This area has been mentioned multiple times in the news lately, and I'm sure you can imagine that it's for a good reason." Thinking back, something from the recent headlines had caught her eye. Looking at her general surroundings, she tried to remember the details. Something about kidnappings. Untraceable, quick, and mostly focused on children, especially those with strong or unique quirks, mostly battle-suited ones. And they were all committed in one small region. The realization snapped Uraraka back toward reality. "If you're implying what I think you are, then we need to leave. Fast." Todoroki shook his head once more. "That may not be an option. I suspected that we were being followed back in a more populated area and tried to lead the group away without alerting the others. I knew that if Bakugo was aware he'd insist on confrontation, and if Izuku or Ida realized, they wouldn't be able to keep quiet. What I didn't stop to think was that at every turn that led to a more populated area, there was another person posted to deter me. If my observations are correct, we've been corralled to this spot." Uraraka felt her heart racing, adrenaline spiking. "No!" Her thoughts rebelled. "I'm not a coward. I'm a hero, and if worst comes to worst I'll fight. It's pretty much my job after all." Still she felt her knees knocking together. The kidnappers that she had read about in the papers were highly specialized. They had only been spotted once during the job by the acclaimed pro-hero, Best Jeanist, and had still escaped with their hostage. The child, a middle schooler aspiring to be a hero, had never been seen again by his parents or otherwise. Apparently he had had a very strong quirk as well, something that stopped time in a bubble around him, yet according to the single witness he hadn't had a chance of escape against his captors. She was beginning to think that this entire exercise had been a big mistake on the part of the pros, but at the same time she knew the kidnappers had supposedly been inactive since their encounter with Best Jeanist, which was a month ago. There really shouldn't have been a problem, but then again here they were. In a daze, Uraraka watched Todoroki walk over to speak calmly to the others. The reactions on their faces said enough. "Well, why the hell didn't you tell us sooner?" Bakugo roared, advancing on Todoroki with one fist ready. "Stop it!" Ida interjected, stepping between the angry Bakugo and slightly peeved-looking Todoroki. "This obviously isn't the time to fight. It doesn't matter why he didn't tell us as long as we know now. We need to act as a group to remove the threat." Both parties begrudgingly muttered their agreement, though ice could be seen forming on Todoroki's right hand. Just as Bakugo began to advance once more, the sound of loud clicking could be heard from the direction of Izuku. He blushed as all faces present focused on him. "I'm going to call Aizawa and tell him our location." It's the best course of action right now, he explained, somewhat confidently, just finishing typing the number. Ida barely had time to voice his consent of the action before the phone was sent flying with a loud thwack, hitting a brick wall a few feet away from Izuku's still open hand. Sorry, kid, but I can't exactly have you calling for help now, can I? A voice hissed from the shelter of a nearby alleyway. A few seconds later, scratching could be heard from almost every direction around the group, and they were forced to take an outward-facing defensive stance. Come out and fight me, you cowards. Unless you think you can't take me. Bakugo yelled out, swiveling his head to face the walls around him as he spoke. Not soon after, more scuffling could be heard unseen. Oh, trust me, I'm sure we can and will take you. But first, I'd like to see if you're worth it. Another projectile came rocketing out of the darkness, almost too fast for Uraraka's eyes to catch. Just before the object could lodge itself into Bakugo's exposed throat, it hit a wall of ice. Thanks, icy hot. Bakugo hissed, kneeling into a battle stance. But I didn't need the help. Uraraka's wide eyes were still fixated on the rouge projectile, which now appeared to be some sort of quill resembling a porcupine's. The only difference was that this quill was about a foot long, and coated with some sort of unidentifiable liquid that seemed suspiciously like poison. Nice reflexes. The unknown voice cheered. Just like on television. We've had our eyes on you for a while, but it's still nice to see your quirk in person. Uraraka realized with a start that the kidnappers had likely viewed the UA tournament. They knew all their strengths, weaknesses, and quirks, which meant that this attack was certainly premeditated. Their chances of escape were looking increasingly slim. Of course, we do have a client who has an eye on Broccoli Boy specifically, so you're actually only second priority. Sorry, not sorry. The voice's owner slowly began to slink out of its hiding place along with two previously unheard figures. The speaker was a tall, slim man who looked to be about in his mid-20s. Though his entire appearance absolutely screamed sordid, Uraraka guessed that his quirk was made up of the long, deadly sharp spines on his back and tail, which looked exactly like those which had previously rocketed towards Bakugo. Each was dripping with the same liquid as well. The man's two companions were much more mysterious, however, as neither had obvious quirks. Each member's face was covered by an ornate black masquerade reminiscent mask. Other forms also appeared in the alleys around them, though they were blurry in the corners of Uraraka's vision. In fact, if our little green friend comes quietly, we won't even have to lay a hand on the pretty lady or appealing blonde. The figure added with a visible smirk. Bakugo, however, was not quite so amused. Come over here and I'll show you something appealing. The bright scarlet of your bloodied face. He screeched, a look of pure race contorting his features. The lead figure released a high-pitched snicker. Oh, I like you. You're fun. It's really too bad that you're such a possible threat. He flicked his wrist, and Todoroki reacted to the signal a bit too late. Expecting a frontal attack, he shielded the wrong side of Bakugo, and the shocked and enraged teen was hit by a circular device from behind. Obviously miffed beyond reason, Bakugo turned to remove the disc, but not before it emitted a sharp shock which sent him twitching to the ground. After a few minutes, the boy failed to stir, and Uraraka realized with a twinge of fear that he had lost consciousness. See, kiddos? Be quiet and meek and we've got no issues. I promise if you all agree to just walk over to my friend here, we'll escort you to your destination without any unnecessary pain. The man gestured to the girl beside him, who smiled threateningly. No. We refuse to barter with low-life criminals such as yourselves. Back down or you'll be swiftly put out of commission. Ida promised, preparing to charge. No. Kids like you are such a bore. Quit the Justice CRP and get mad like Blondie over there. It's much more interesting. Without another word, Ida charged. Though it seemed like he was going to hit the man head-on, there was swift movement at the last second. In a blur, the man stabbed Ida with a needle, and he fell to the ground almost instantly. Izuku made a face as though he had been the one injured, and looked about ready to charge himself. Don't worry, Broccoli. Your friend isn't dead, just tranquilized. Or at least he should be. It's tough to always get the proper dosage. There are so many different sizes of targets after all. The formerly quiet accomplice to the left of the outspoken one suddenly stepped forward. "Stop tormenting them, Quill. This is unnecessary and cruel," he commanded, and surprisingly the other man backed off. "Fine," he growled. "But if they don't comply, we don't have any other choice." To Uraraka's shock, Izuku suddenly forced his way forward. "Hey, if what I heard was right, you're mostly after me," he began, grabbing the attention of the two men. "I'll come along quietly if you leave my friends alone." The quieter man nodded, and to Todoroki and Uraraka's dismay, Izuku ran over to stand beside the women as ordered. She immediately extended a finger towards him, touching his forehead. Immediately afterwards he disappeared without a trace. Uraraka didn't know what to do. It was likely that Izuku had done the right thing. After all, there seemed to be no visible way to win, and it was a hero's job to save as many people as possible. Yet how had the operation gone so wrong so quickly? Unfortunately, there wasn't much time to mull this question over, as Quill was beginning to advance. "Yeah, okay, I know we promised that we'd leave now, but you guys just seem too good to give up." "Sorry, not sorry." Uraraka prayed for an interjection from the other man, but none seemed to come. Fortunately, something else did. Quill swung out his tail to send out more tranq projectiles, but none responded. "Hey, what the hell?" he grunted, right as a thick mist began to fill the alleyway. Some of those gathered began to stumble, and Uraraka felt her eyelids droop unmistakably. She heard a call of, "Scatter, it's the pros," before seeing a trio of figures flee to the area behind her. She caught sight of two people running towards her as she finally dropped into the oblivion of sleep. It had all happened so suddenly. One moment Izuku had been standing in the alleyway, and the next he was sprawled across a cold, compact floor. Though he had been ready to be detained in some manner, he felt truly surprised by the current turn of events. The women's quirk was very specialized, but obviously effective for her chosen career. Despite the circumstances, Izuku found himself wondering if all the events had involved the women's quirk. It was really a shame she chose to use it for the purpose she did. After all, it had great potential as a disaster rescue quirk. Izuku could feel his mind drifting to the topic of quirk analysis, a habit he had gained as a child to cope with stressful situations, and began to shake himself from thoughts. While the tendency to consider an enemy's abilities could come in handy in the right situation, Izuku recognized the current need to place his focus elsewhere, and decided to make escape his top priority. Though he could tell the ground below him was composed of concrete, he couldn't gather the nature of his surroundings due to the room's lack of lighting. He tried to stand to gauge the amount of free space in the room, but felt an overwhelming wave of vertigo almost immediately. The feeling was enough to make him drop back to the ground on his knees, where he stayed for a few minutes to regain his composure. Hoping the effect was temporary, Izuku rose again only to be met with the same pungent nausea and dizziness. Am I feeling this way because of shock, an outside force, or as an aftereffect of the transportation quirk? Well, either way, I guess I'll just have to resort to crawling. He felt his way across the floor, and after a few seconds his hand collided with a wall. After reeling back a bit in pain, he began to follow the structure till he reached a corner. Eventually, he discovered that the room was exceedingly small in the shape of a square which extended only about 5 feet on all sides. There was a door, but it seemed metallic and hardly mobile, and Izuku believed that his earlier loss of equilibrium would stop him from using his quirk to bash it down. Of course, at this point, he was willing to try anything. Storing up a bit of power around his finger and releasing it on the door seemed to be his best option at the moment, and though he knew it would be difficult to avoid injury on impact, escape was well worth the risk. Almost as soon as he activated One for All, however, he was hit with an even stronger force of wooziness, leaving him reeling on the ground, though this time his recovery took much longer. So, no means of escape, huh? He thought, rubbing his temples in an attempt to decrease his escalating headache. I'll just have to wait and ambush whoever comes through the door then. He tried not to think of how difficult to be to ambush someone in pitch darkness, or how someone with a strong and utterly disabling quirk was likely ready to incapacitate him if he showed any signs of rebellion, or how no one had ever escaped wherever he was before. He was failing, of course, but he was still trying to his credit. He couldn't help but wonder if the room had any vents or cameras installed. Of course, there was nothing he could do, even in the case that there was a vent large enough for a teenager to fit in, but his suspicions about the cameras were seeming much more valid. Whoever had the quirk that kept affecting him was obviously not located in the room along with him, and the quirk only activated when he showed signs of resistance. The offender shouldn't be able to tell what he was doing without some sort of visual aid, and the fact that they only tried to affect him when necessary instead of constantly meant that there was likely a limit to how long they could use their ability. Testing his theory, Izuku stood in the cell, and just as expected he felt the same tension as before. The only difference was that this time, he planned to stay standing. It was by no means easy, and by what he thought was the 15-second mark his head felt about ready to rupture. It took everything he had not to regurgitate his lunch into the cramped space around him, but luckily he was able to keep his composure. Then, right as he thought he would drop, the pressure in his temple stopped, and he was able to clumsily rush to the door. Using only a small percentage of his quirk to avoid injury, he kicked the metal from its hinges and dashed out into the adjacent hall. He was blinded by the light of the corridor, however, and wasn't alerted in the slightest before a steady force crashed into his right side, knocking him against what he assumed was a wall. Before he could retaliate, he felt the vertigo assault him once more and collapsed. What the hell? He heard a voice mutter above him, though it faded in and out in accordance with the pain in Izuku's head. Yo Watanabe! What gives? The second cry was much louder than the last, and despite the crippling pain Izuku forced his hands to cover his ears. Though his eyesight was returning, it was slow, and he was still unable to pick up on much around him. Besides, the unrelenting vertigo as well as the feeling of a foot on his shoulder kept him pinned to the ground anyways. Don't use my real name around prisoners. A static clouded voice reprimanded loudly, somehow managing to sound concerned and exasperated at once. Based on the situation, Izuku guessed that it was whoever was using their quirk on him speaking over an intercom system. This is the new one Quill, Copy, and Shade were sent to catch. He got here a few minutes ago and has been insufferable ever since. That door is coming out of your paycheck, by the way, not mine. After this statement, Izuku was once again forced to cover his ears in shock as gruff laughter echoed above him. Sure, no problem, Watanabe, but for the record it's your fault he got loose. I was just standing outside minding my own business. A loud sigh carried across the intercom, and Izuku could practically see the accompanying eye roll. Well, if it's no problem, then I'd like it if you could find a new place to keep the kid till his doctor's visit. I can't hold him down much longer and he certainly doesn't fancy sitting still. Despite his persisting malady, Izuku found himself being lifted up by the collar. Since his eyesight had returned at this point, he was finally able to see his attacker. The man before him was extremely tough-looking and stood at about 198 centimeters. It was easy to guess that his quirk likely matched his outward appearance, especially since he was put on guard duty. A mask obscured the man's face, which matched those worn by the thugs who had attacked Izuku in the alleyway. As Izuku was dragged through the hall, he could see a large number of cells that matched the one he had been placed in. Based on documents posted on each door, Izuku could tell that many were occupied or at least had been recently. Each possessed information including a name, gender, age, and detailed quirk description, though it was difficult to focus on details. Based on the quality and quantity of the area, it was evident that the group, whoever they were, did very well for themselves. Eventually the man stopped in front of an empty room, opened the door, and tossed Izuku inside as if he were a pillow. His landing was not without a myriad of scrapes, and he began to wince again as the offender spoke. Stay put this time, kid. You'll have to visit the psychologist soon, and I don't want to be the one to explain your absence to her. Izuku wanted to send back some sort of retort, but the aforementioned Watanabe had been sending small, consistent shocks to his head over the course of the journey. The door shut with a loud clang, and Izuku was once again alone. Though he heard sets of footsteps pass by his room often, he waited hours without a visit. Time seemed to crawl by, and it was mostly due to boredom that Izuku eventually found the ground comfortable enough for sleep. Though Ennui went through tens of appointments a week, she never failed to be enthralled by the behavior of each of her subjects. Every individual human being had a myriad of reactions at their fingertips for any given situation, and which they chose to use told volumes about their characters, especially in stressful situations. It was an immensely entertaining practice, and one that couldn't be more rewarding as a career in Anwi's opinion. To her, nothing was more entertaining than sizing someone up and seeing how they broke down, and if it had to be done under such sordid circumstances, then so be it. After all, there was no place the women could legally use a quirk such as hers in today's society without causing outrage from one party or another. Today was an especially exciting day though, as Anwi was finally going to have the opportunity to operate on a true hero in training. Despite the masquerade's infamy as a criminal organization among the bottom feeders of Japan, they had never really committed a kidnapping so bold as that which they had just undertook. In fact, the company had been conceptualized with the idea in mind that it would only capture children of little background so not to draw unwanted attention, and it was to do so over the course of months instead of days. The group's initial success, however, had inclined them to act to the contrary, and now they not only practiced their craft in a brighter light but also far more frequently. Having been a founding member, Anwi herself had initially been opposed to the idea of a more public approach, but usually couldn't argue with the results. Clients were much more apt to dispense their cash on pre-advertised weapons such as UA students than diamond-in-the-rough slum brats, and it was far more pleasant for the women when she had a varied cast of people to study. Even following the bidding processes, Anwi kept a detailed description of their quirks and mental state, both before and after her tampering had taken effect. Quill often insulted her for it, calling the practice morbid and her interest obsessive, though she didn't feel he had the right to talk when he was the one assigned to capture duty. Especially after the incident that occurred during the last abduction. It seemed that the masquerade's more open actions recently had finally blown up in their faces. Despite the group's meticulous planning to the opposite effect, they had somehow managed to attract the attention of professional heroes whilst leaving 4 witnesses alive in their wake. And it wasn't even as if the school tried to cover it up either, despite the immediate ill effects on their public representation. And of course, some senseless higher-up had decided to make the organization thematic enough to recognize on sight. Anwi had never even worn one of the idiotic masks herself, but of course they happened to be uniform. It didn't make it any less painful that she had had such a heavy hand in planning the abduction either. It had seemed so simple on paper, pretty much the same concept as exterminating a pest. Stay quiet for a while to draw them out and lure them into a false sense of security, corner them while they were out of their hiding place, strike, then gather a windfall of yen and research to boot. Not to mention that the school had given them all the information they needed through televised events. The analysis team hadn't even be required for pre-planning. Of course, Quill, Copy, and Shade didn't seem to have benefited. This was only made worse by the fact that the group composed the Masquerade's most infamously discreet capture squad. If her job was compromised, she really had no clue what she'd be forced to do. Despite Masquerade's recent fame, the group was hardly invincible. The only thing Anwi thought could calm her nerves at this point was a good distraction, and luckily she had an especially interesting one waiting for her cue. The thought of the appointment had been all that brought her to work that morning, but still hadn't been enough to pull her out of her mood, which was really too bad considering how volatile it made her actions towards others. Well, it certainly wouldn't stop her from clicking the intercom to call in her guest. Vex, please send in Ranger and Brute with the next subject. She articulated coldly, flipping through her clipboard in the meantime. I'm sending him over. There was a short pause before the next bit of dialogue. Thank you for using my professional name, by the way. Anwi almost had to stifle a laugh at that. Vex was their newest recruit and one of 3 rotating watchdogs. She suspected that he had been painfully aware of this recently despite his impressive captive repression skills. It was certainly impressive that the student had escaped under his watch regardless of his level of experience. There were multiple points of interest that Anwi noted on her clipboard as the subject was lead in, the main one being his posture. It practically screamed defiance, which spoke volumes about the difficulty level of the job. He wasn't openly frightened in the least, unlike what she estimated was at least 80% of her usual demographic, but rather seemed entirely devoid of the emotion. That was not to say that he didn't look shaken though. His hair, which according to pictures was usually rather unruly, looked especially disheveled from his sleeping arrangements. His wrists and ankles were bound and almost raw from contact with their metal constraints, and bruises stood out on his left side. Anhui thought it was likely that they were badges of his earlier altercation with Ranger, who looked as intimidating and uncomfortable as normal. Anhui quickly waved the two out after the subject was seated, though she was careful to ensure that Vex's attention was focused on her office before relaxing. She hoped she wasn't yet quite inconsiderate enough to leave herself undefended against such a capable opponent, be he a child or not. She spared one last careless glance at her briefing before looking back up to address the boy. "So, you're Izuku Midoriya." Anhui spoke in a factual manner instead of a quizzical one, creating her first opportunity to view the child's reactions and hopefully get a clear reading. "Welcome to my office." Not much of a reaction from that. Just more silent defiance. Oh well, that told just as much about him as any words would. "I'm not exactly sure that you've been informed of your purpose here, but I intend to make it as clear as possible for you." Finally some sort of entropy. The boy's eyes had flicked towards her expectantly, ready to take in information. "Before I go around telling you anything though, I'd love to listen to any questions you have on the subject and respond as best as I can." Once again she laced her words in a commanding tone rather than a friendly one. While the boy's response was delayed, it was still present. His slightly hopeful expression was a precursor. "Fine. But how do I know you'll answer my questions honestly?" Anhui shook her head. "You don't. But wouldn't you rather have some sort of idea of your circumstances than none at all? After all, even if I do nothing but lie to you, at least you'll have something to do for a few minutes, assuming we plan to just send you back to your cell afterwards." The subject seemed to consider this for a second before formulating a response, his expression calculating. "Okay then. Where are we?" A very simple question to begin with, but Anhui was positive she could lead the conversation in a more interesting direction given time. "I can't tell you much other than that it's an unnamed facility in Japan which really isn't anything at all." "Why do you ask? Are you hoping for some sort of rescue?" The look on the boy's face confirmed her suspicions. A small spot of anxiety in his otherwise calm facade. Just as she had expected, he was much more afraid than he was letting on. The look did disappear as soon as it had come, however, and his expression was once again nonchalant and uncaring. "Why wouldn't I be? I was just abducted." Anhui smiled. That was a good answer. Better than she'd expected. Nothing was used to hide fear more than insults. "Fair point. But I must warn you, rescue really isn't an option. We captured your friends not soon after you departed, so no one who isn't in your situation is even aware you've been taken. I'm sure they could guess, of course, but how long until they took action? Days? Weeks? Even hours could seal your fate. But of course you don't really know much about that yet." The women's bluff worked. Fear enveloped Midoriya's face, and this time it didn't leave. Now she was tasked with finding out whether it stemmed from the thought of danger to himself or others. "Your accomplices promised you'd leave the others alone if I played along. I guess I probably shouldn't have even considered the possibility of honesty there in retrospect." He came along because of threats to others? This was just what she needed. Anhui was starting to believe she should hold longer discussions with the capture squad. "Certainly not. But I must admit it was very heroic of you, choosing to protect your friends with even such a slim chance of escape hanging in the balance. A shame that all that gallantry is going to go to waste." Anhui leaned back in her chair leisurely. At this point in the game, it was essential to stay confident if she wished to keep her subject in a position of powerless curiosity. "What do you plan on doing to us?" Midoriya's voice was a bit shaky now, a very good sign. Obviously it has something to do with combatability based on your prior targets, but... His voice cracked to punctuate the sentence. "How would we make soldiers out of them? That's what you're thinking, correct? I'm glad you asked, because you're about to find out the answer one way or another." Anhui flipped through the pages tethered to her clipboard until she came across the document she was searching for, halting the progress with a fingertip. Her eyes slowly scanned the paper as she began to read aloud. Command. A simple quirk to match a simple name, though its effects would be difficult to consider banal. The holder of this ability is able to utter a single sentence to their chosen target upon first physical contact. If this sentence happens to be in order, then the victim will be irrevocably compelled to follow it. This command will be permanent in the psyche of the victim, taking root and demanding to be acted upon as would an innate animal instinct. If the command is ignored, then the aggressor will experience the same kind of deterioration and pain as if they were refusing to eat or sleep. Committing the action, however, will satisfy the physical demand for the action as well as the mental, releasing dopamine into the brain as it does so. Over time and with experience, the feeling will become more difficult to ignore in most cases, eventually leading to dependence. Done with the text, Ennui lowered the clipboard, looking up at the subject. At this point there was no hiding the panic on his face, a point which Ennui took a special pride in. Perhaps her quirk wasn't flashy, but it never failed to allow her control over others, both in a direct and indirect sense. Though the reactions she received were well worth the effort, the early telling of such information could lead to understandable complications as well. Right now, for instance, Izuku Midoriya had attempted to stand but immediately thereafter been constrained by Vex's quirk. It was times like these that Ennui appreciated his quirk's wide field of area. It only took a few moments for Ennui to think up what command she wanted to use. An order which would break the target down mentally while also keeping in line with the client's ideals in a weapon. And a single word no less. Ennui even had an idea of how the subject's training would proceed thereafter, so there really wasn't any need for hesitation. As Ennui reached out her hand toward Izuku's, he began to flinch away, obviously still capable of movement. Ignoring the resistance, she lightly grazed his knuckles with her pointer finger, speaking a sole word. Kill. Though Ennui's quirk always left her drained, it was nothing compared to its effect on its target. Ennui slouched back against her desk, but she saw Izuku stop moving altogether a few feet away. Collecting herself enough to regain her breath, she then rose up off the ground to call Ranger and Brute to lead the subject to his new cell. Though the whole exchange had been a bit tedious, it hadn't been boring either. Besides, the remainder of the subject's preparation would take planning, and the thought of a job well done was reward enough for now. Hopefully the clients in question were willing to wait long enough. They hadn't exactly seemed like the patient types. Bakugu was said. And not just your run-of-the-mill "oh no Bakuga said it again" type of said either. A better word for it would probably be furious. Though it had only been one day since the solo mission, the entire event was still cycling through his head on repeat. Well, the parts he was awake for were at least, though he was painfully aware of what had transpired even then. According to Icy Hot and Gravity Girl, he had not only lost to a group of good-for-nothing C-list villains, relied on others to save his and failed to outlast even Four Eyes, but he had also somehow managed to lose Deku to kidnappers in the process. As if things couldn't get any worse. Bakugo was informed that the whole class had been shocked when they were told, but he had been too busy recovering in the infirmary to be there for it. By the time he got back to the dorms later that night, the common rooms had been desolate. The entire thing felt like some sort of weird dream that he could wake up from at any moment, but unfortunately that hadn't been the case. When Bakugo had awoke that morning, it was due to the crowds of reporters gathered just outside the school's walls. UA hadn't done much in the way of damage control, it seemed. No one was too surprised to find out that classes had been cancelled for the day, especially considering the sheer amount of concerned parents, friends, and press who were constantly showering the students of Class 1A in phone calls and text messages. Bakugo could only imagine how Inko Midoriya must be feeling. He kept trying to tell himself that it wasn't his fault. Izuku had been stupid enough to go along with the villains, so he obviously deserved the blame. Not to mention that he hadn't escaped yet to come and fix the FNG depressing mood everyone seemed to want to drown in. But even then, the whole reason Bakugo had gone along was to watch after the dumbass nerd, and if this could be considered a fulfillment of that promise, then the entire world had gone to shit. Bakugo had spent most of the morning training in the field behind the school, sure that it would come in handy soon. Plans were being made to track down the group behind the kidnappings, but without any leads besides the masks the members wore, it was taking a while. Still, Bakugo wanted to be ready when it was time to confront them. He was going to get revenge for being humiliated, and then those freaks would be sorry. Bakugo was so immersed in his practice that he hardly noticed when someone came out to join him on the field. What finally got his attention was the loud, echoing crash of something incredibly heavy plummeting to the pavement almost directly behind him. Pivoting into a defensive stance, he turned to come face to face with a large slab of concrete. After searching for the origin of the projectile for a few seconds, the blonde was shocked to see that a breathing, but fuming Uraraka was the source. As soon as the two's eyes met, the girl's gaze flashed to the ground, almost guiltily, before settling on another target. Bakugo watched in stunned silence for a bit as the brunette managed to set a whole group of slabs afloat and send them crashing down close by. He wanted to be angry that he was being made to share training space with the girl, but was too impressed by her drive to show annoyance. Most of his other classmates had decided to spend the day off with those close to them, or simply locked themselves away to be immersed in hobbies. Bakugo had believed he was the only one stubborn enough to put effort into anything today, but evidently he was wrong. "Look, I know you were here first, but I'm not leaving. I have as much right to be here as you." The words came as another surprise to Bakugo, tearing him out of his thoughts and back into the real world. With a shock of defensiveness, Bakugo realized that he had been staring at the girl across the field for a long time, far too long to be considered friendly coming from him. Instead of apologizing, though, he decided to take an approach which was more his style. He approached the spot where Uraraka stood, swagger and confidence evident in the way he walked. "Oi, Bubblegum Beach, if you think you have as much right to this field as me, then you'd better fight me for it." While Bakugo knew that the response lacked tact and could possibly even get him a rock to the face, he was too enamored with the idea of practical training to back down against the girl's challenge. Besides, he had a reputation to uphold, even after such an unexpectedly tragic event. "Well, if that's how it has to be, then I'm willing to fight for it." Uraraka belted, rage shooting across her usually amicable face. Her body took up the stance of a boxer before a punch, and she had already begun to focus on the possible projectiles around her. "But only if we do it right here, right now." Bakugo loosed an anticipant grin. Though this was the last behavior he had expected coming from his cheerful peer, he could hardly say he was upset. If he had to guess, he thought her newfound courage originated from her failure to perform out in the city, same as his, though hers likely had a lot more to do with Izuku's abduction. Either way, this was bound to be interesting. "That's what I was planning on." Bakugo agreed, backing away and falling into his own starting position. "Let's go easy on the rules. We're allowed to fight till one of us either forfeits or collapses, no holds barred." The girl opposite of him simply nodded in response, her messy chocolate hair framing a determined face and fists reared up at her sides. With nothing left to say, Bakugo simply charged, explosions blaring from either palm. Tough Uraraka looked a bit taken aback. She slid nimbly out of the way, sending a shower of grit and dirt into Bakugo's eyes. Taking no time to squint, the boy pivoted and attempted to throw a punch at the sound of shoes on gravel a bit away from his position. Vision slightly clouded, Bakugo barely managed to react to his adversary's counter. By feinting out of the way of the punch, Uraraka had managed to get a grip on Bakugo's upper arm and was attempting to use his lack of balance to send him spiraling to the ground. The much stronger hero easily pushed him elbow down to collide with the brunette's stomach, and though winded, she was able to roll away and rise back up behind him, sending a firm kick to his back. Even in the heat of battle, Bakugo couldn't help but be pleasantly amazed by Uraraka's newfound combat skills. He had never really viewed her as much of a fair threat in the past, mostly due to her lack of melee skills, but she was holding her own fairly well. Bakugo almost felt bad that he was going to defeat her. Almost. Tough, the kick had sent him off balance once more. He recovered much faster than from the punch. He turned to use a sweeping kick on Uraraka, but was surprised to see that she wasn't present. He then looked up just in time to see that a couple of rocks had drifted above his unprotected head. He tried to jump away as quickly as possible, eyes scanning the field for his opponent until, there she was. Standing a yard or so away, right next to a generous supply of gravity-powered ammo. And she had the nerve to smirk. Unable to dodge fast enough, one of the falling pieces of granite hit Bakugo's leg just above the ankle. Grunting in a bit in pain, the boy scanned the air above him for more projectiles. Uraraka seemed to be setting them afloat at different intervals across the field, leaving them ready for release if Bakugo approached. In the time it took to see this, she had even managed to make the number of projectiles grow, and it didn't seem as though she was stopping. Unfortunately, Bakugo would need to get over to the girl somehow since his attacks relied almost entirely on close combat, but at the same time it would be tough to make it over without landing himself a rock to the skull. He did a quick once-over of his surroundings and began to notice something regarding the airborne rocks. Each was suspended at a different height due to the rate at which the girl sent them into orbit, and a few were clustered especially low near a tree at his end of the field. It was risky, but if he was quick enough he was sure he could make it work. Dashing towards the tree, he used a few low-lying branches to make his way up to a desired height. Once he was satisfied with his running start, Bakugo launched himself off onto one of the rocks. From there, he jumped across the craggy stones towards his target at an alarming pace. Though the unanchored discs hardly made for smooth sailing, momentum and speed were enough to carry him as long as he didn't slow. Uraraka, obviously unprepared for the assault, looked rather anxiously around before slamming her fingertips together. Gravity sent Bakugo tumbling to the dirt floor, though he made the landing less harsh by ducking into a roll as he made contact. Though Uraraka had done well in stopping Bakugo's approach, she was unable to drop some rocks without sending all the others down as well, and was now painfully defenseless. Using an explosion, Bakugo rocketed out of his position, crash-tackling Uraraka to the ground. As he heard the grunt of pain below him, Bakugo knew it was time to stop. He stood, breathing, before boldly crossing his arms over his chest. Now you know better than to fight me. The field's me dash, huff. Bakugo halted mid-sentence, unsure of what he had just heard. Though Uraraka's head was facing the dirt, he could have sworn that had been the girl's voice. What the hell did you just say to me? He grunted, glaring at the brunette's figure. You heard me. The girl nearly growled as she rose to her feet, back still turned. I told you to F. On the last two words, Uraraka turned to face Bakugo, tears streaming down her face. Now this was something Bakugo hadn't been prepared for. He had never seen the girl as emotional as she was right now, and though she had agreed to the fight he couldn't help but think it was his fault. Had he misread the situation? Look, Bubblegum Beach, I was just giving you what you asked for. You said you wanted to fight me, so don't go gettin', said. Bakugo was admittedly a bit confused by the behavior, and wanted an explanation if not an outright out to the conversation. He certainly was not good with this kind of thing. Ugh, you just can't read a situation to save your life, can you? The girl snarled back, wiping a dirt-coated arm across her damp face. Even after all this practice, I still can't hold my own against you, so how am I going to manage to save Izuku? So that was it. She was out here for the same reasons as he was. The feeling of assurance must have shown on his face, because Uraraka scoffed disgustedly not soon after the thought. I know you wouldn't understand. You tried your best to save him. But me? I couldn't even move as he walked right into danger. How terrible of a hero am I? Go ahead and tell me I deserve it. I'm a coward and a weakling just like you thought. Unsure of how to respond, Bakugo shook his head, mulling over which words to use. The girl I just fought. She wasn't weak. Sure, you need to improve, but you held your own for much longer than I expected. And no coward would ever have the courage to fight me in the first place. He declared. He had no urge to spare the girl's feelings, but he was simply being honest. Maybe a bit brutally honest, but still. That was a pretty pathetic attempt to cheer me up, but coming from you it sounds surprisingly genuine. She replied, a small grin forming on the edges of her lips. Besides, just imagine. The Bakugo Katsuki acting nice. I'll have to tell the whole class. Don't you dare. Bakugo roared, but when he looked back to Uraraka the girl was rolling with fits of laughter. Hey, stop it. It's not funny. Sorry. The girl apologized between breathless giggles. It's just your reaction was so on point. Slowly, the laughter died down, and Uraraka got back on her feet, dusting off her uniform. Bakugo could feel the mood once again growing somber. I'm sorry for breaking down like that in front of you. I know we'll save Izuku, but I just felt so incapable when I was the only one who stood and did nothing as he was carted off. I came out here to train, but when I saw you, I thought that if I won against you it would prove that I could've. Maybe it would have just made me feel more guilty, but I can't stand being idle when I know he's out there somewhere, probably suffering. Uraraka trailed off, a gloomy look on her face before snapping back to her senses and grimacing at Bakugo. Wait, why am I even telling this to you? She looked down and shook her head as if to ward away the stupidity of the action, hair wisps flying around her face. For some reason Bakugo felt the need to amend the situation somehow. It was the weirdest feeling, but he almost empathized with Uraraka. And though he never would have wanted to be pitted in this state, he thought a bit of reassurance couldn't hurt. No, normally I'd be flipping my sheet at this, but I kind of get where you're coming from. Bakugo reluctantly agreed, focusing on a random point in the distance as he spoke. That shitty nerd may be a nuisance, but I sure as hell don't want him gone. He's good for a fight if nothing else. Besides, I certainly should have done more. I lost to a gang of nobodies, and because of all this FING publicity the whole country knows it. Apparently when Aizawa had gotten Izuku's call, he had been surveying a part of the city nearby in order to be close in case of emergency. Though it had cut off almost immediately, he had assumed the worst based on a snippet of frantic dialogue that had come across the receiver before hanging up. Sending for backup to help with the situation had been both a good and bad idea, as the only hero close enough to help had been Midnight, who at the time was doing a televised interview. Though she hurried to help, she was tailed by reporters, and the questioning following the event had been caught on camera, revealing pretty much everything regarding the abduction, the consequences of which were already showing themselves in the negative media UA was receiving. Well, thanks I guess. That was nice in a really weird, misconstrued way. You're on a roll today. Uraraka grinned again, but this time it seemed like a shadow of its former glory. I have to go back to my dorm since I promised Mina I'd tell her more about what happened yesterday, but if you ever want a training partner again, contact me, okay? I'm determined to win next time. Bakugo nodded, stifling a grin at the thought of the challenge. Sure thing, Gravity Girl. Just make sure you don't hold back again. With that said, Bakugo turned and walked off to continue his practice alone. He couldn't help but hold a newfound respect for the girl, even if it was small. Well, that was cathartic. Uraraka pondered as she climbed the stairs of the dorm building. Who would have expected Bakugo of all people to be comforting? No, wait, maybe it was to be expected. After all, the two of them had both been there for the event. It would only stand to reason that they would have similar impressions of it. Besides, Uraraka had always had a sneaking suspicion that Bakugo cared much more for his classmates than he let on, though it wasn't always present. For the life of her, she still couldn't figure out why Bakugo, king of the class, would feel it necessary to bully an underdog like Izuku. Perhaps it had something to do with their shared past. Instead of heading straight to Mina's dorm for her meeting, Uraraka dropped by the common room fridge first to grab a mineral water. She had gotten very dehydrated during the fight, a consequence which she hoped couldn't be credited to her embarrassing episode of tears. To her surprise, the common room wasn't empty when she entered. Todoroki, Momo, and Ida were gathered around the room, each on either a phone or laptop. Uraraka tried to step lightly so as not to disturb them, but Todoroki looked up at the sound of the door closing, blowing her cover. Hello everyone, sorry to interrupt. I promise I'll be right in and out, she assured, moving across the carpet to get to the kitchenette. It's no problem, Uraraka, Momo promised, swiveling her neck to greet the other girl with a welcoming grin. We're just doing a bit of research on recent crime trends. You're free to join us if you'd like. Uraraka shook her head, silently noting the omission of the research's purpose. It was odd, though everyone was trying to help find Izuku, it was almost as if no one wanted to admit he was even gone. As if it was some kind of imaginary circumstance and talking about it would somehow make it true. I'd love to stay and help, but I have to meet Mina in her dorm, she responded, opening the fridge as she spoke. She and I were going to talk about Dash. Hey guys. An enthusiastic-looking Mina burst into the room, raising her phone aloft in her right hand with her left gesturing grandly at the screen. I found a lead. The pink-haired girl gushed, leaping over one of the couchbacks to land directly beside a bewildered Momo. See, I was scrolling through the search results, and on like page 24 I found this chat room where someone mentioned a guy with a quirk like the one you told me about, Shudo. Uraraka walked over to tap Mina on the head, giving a small wave and smile when she looked up. Oh hey Uraraka. Crazy running into you here. I was waiting for you in my dorm, but I kind of got pulled into the whole research thing too. I was hoping that I'd run into you soon though, 'cause Todoroki filled everyone here in already. It'd be really cool if you still wanted to hang with us though. Of course. Uraraka answered, shifting to take a seat beside Ida. But first, tell us about the lead. No problem. So, like I said, this chat room mentions a guy similar to the one you described, and to make things even more suspicious, the people seem to be talking about how he could do a favor for some dude in the chat. Weird, right? Mina flexed the phone around in a perfect 360, showing the people in the room the alleged chat. Momo, upon seeing the screen, began to type feverishly into her laptop, making the same image appear on its screen in a few seconds. You must have looked very hard to find this. This chat is old, and most of the messages are buried pretty deep. Don't underestimate the determination of Mina Ishido. The girl cheered, pumping her fist. I'm really good at most stuff that has to do with social media, and you wouldn't believe how quickly I can scan walls of text for keywords. One thing led to another and eventually it led me here. I'm just happy it might finally come in handy for something serious. You're amazing, Mina. Uraraka leaned down over Momo's shoulder to view the chat, her eyes catching on a certain phrase. So it seems as though this guy needed to hire mercenaries for some sort of expedition, probably an illegal one, and someone suggested their friend. They described him as a tall, skinny porcupine-looking dude, almost impossible to miss. They also said he was really rude and tough to work with, but would make up for it in performance. Sounds familiar, right? Mina asked. If we gave this to someone professional, I bet they could track the guy who posted it and question him or something. Todoroki seemed a bit more skeptical. The description certainly matches one of the men we encountered, but we hardly have enough information to prove it's him. There could be plenty of vulgar people in Japan with a porcupine quirk. There isn't so much that we can legally do with the information, but perhaps the circumstances will allow us to do a bit more digging than usual. Good work. Mina blushed a bit, obviously not expecting a compliment from her usually neutral peer. Like I said, it's no problem. Let's just hope it's enough. She reiterated, smiling from ear to ear. Yes, Mina, thank you for continuing to be a model student and hero. Ida piped up, patting his friend on the back as he rose to leave the room. I will go alert someone more equipped to deal with the situation of this new development. The gathered students all spoke their agreement before Ida took off into the hall. Though the day still hung with a stench of depression and failure, Uraraka couldn't help but feel hopeful for the future. She was surrounded by friends, all of whom cared just as much for Izuku as she did. Was it weird that the boy left such a memorable impression on all those he came into contact with? No, Uraraka thought. That's just who Izuku is. A friendly and heroic person. It would really be more difficult not to be friends with him. I can never imagine him doing anything that would upset others. He almost never thinks about himself. She once again was hit with a wave of guilt, thinking of how Izuku had sacrificed himself for his friends. Don't worry, she told herself, a confident tone enveloping her inner monologue. We'll save Izuku soon, and then he'll be back here same as always. When Izuku returned to consciousness, the first thing that came to his mind was the aching pain that encompassed his head. The second was the knife poised directly above his throat. Instructively, he reached out his arm to push the weapon away, but whoever its wielder was jumped back before he could even make contact. The sudden withdrawal was accompanied by a shrill squeak, too high to be that of a teenager. Izuku was extremely confused, but the gradually dulling pain echoing across his temples kept him from investigating immediately. It felt as though he had been struck with something exceedingly heavy, but couldn't remember what. Upon gauging his surroundings, however, his memory returned to him. For a second he dwelled on the events that had led him to this point. There was a myriad of questions and concerns that rose to the forefront of his thoughts. though he knew that if they were to answered, it would be with time and not contemplation, so he dismissed them in favor of focusing on the problem at hand. The headache, he reasoned, was likely a byproduct of the women from earlier's quirk. The knife, however, was much more difficult to explain away. By ignoring the strain on his head temporarily, Izuku was able to get into an at least relatively comfortable sitting position, allowing for a view of the room he now occupied. Though it resembled the previous cell in structure, the new room was obviously built with long-term stay in mind. Not only was it significantly more spacious, but it also contained a number of amenities. A single, metal-framed bed was wedged into one of the far corners of the room, not far from a small restroom area. All in all, the area resembled a typical prison cell that one would see on television aside from a few peculiarities. The concrete floors and walls, though mostly clean, had numerous red stains dotting their surfaces, and oddly enough there was a rack of weapons haphazardly leaning against one wall. Lastly, the most unfitting component of the room was the holder of the knife in question, a ragged-looking girl somewhere between the ages of 9 and 12. Though she was trying to put on a brave face, the girl was obviously very shaken. The knife shuddered anxiously in her grasp despite the fact that it was held with both hands, and her stance was entirely defensive. She must have been abducted in a similar manner to Izuku to provoke this kind of reaction, though judging from her unrestricted movement she hadn't undergone the same experiences afterwards. Another confusing factor was the direction of the girl's fear. Though it was to be expected that the girl would be a bit frightened, all of it was focused on Izuku, who really felt as though he couldn't look less threatening in his current state. Of course, if the women from earlier was telling the truth, then he could be horribly incorrect in that assumption. "Stay back," the girl warned, brandishing her weapon in front of her as she spoke. "I'm not afraid to use this thing." Her actions contradicted her words, eyes flashing back and forth from the weapon to the wall beside Izuku, afraid to look him in the eyes. Izuku considered the situation as he formulated a response. The girl was obviously not in the right state to be reasoned with considering her high level of emotion, but at the same time she probably wouldn't calm down without some form of reassurance. Izuku decided that removing himself as a threat was probably the best course of action to take. "Don't worry, I don't plan on hurting you," he insisted in the calmest voice possible. "I'd just like to hear more details about our situation if that's okay with you. I'm a bit in the dark here considering that I just woke up." The girl dropped her guard a bit but kept the knife pointed out in Izuku's direction. Despite the genuine quality his words had possessed, she obviously found it difficult to believe that the danger had passed. "Well, I don't know what you know already, so I need to hear your story before I explain anything. If what you say doesn't add up, I'm not talking at all," she declared, her posture retaining its rigidness. It was probably best to agree to her terms, and it might make her view Izuku as less of a threat. "Okay," Izuku responded amicably. "I was out with some of my friends when we were attacked by some guys who I think work here somewhere. They sent me here, and then I met with someone. A woman with dark hair who wore a suit, and she told me that they had captured my friends too. Then afterward she used her quirk on you, right?" The girl finished, her expression shifting into one of grim expectation. "She told me she did. She also told me what that meant." Izuku nodded, fairly sure of what the girl was getting at. "Yeah. But I don't really feel much different. Other than having a headache, I guess, but that's really not new for me at this point. If you met with her, then does that mean that we're in the same boat?" A doubtful look was thrown in Izuku's direction before the girl spoke. "No, I don't think so. She didn't use her quirk on me or even seem to think I was worth anything. Just told me that since I was quirkless I was dispensable enough to be sent here." Before Izuku could ask exactly what that meant, he had a sudden realization. This cell is meant for one person, judging by the size and furniture, and the weapons rack would imply that one of us isn't meant to leave alive. Yeah. Now the situation made much more sense. The people who had trapped him here were human traffickers who sold and created weapons for the city's underground crime population. They were popular enough to warrant a large area of business as well as multiple hires who possessed rare and unusual quirks. Why not train their merchandise in the most realistic way possible? But that's crazy. No matter what she said, her quirk was, "I would never kill anyone." especially an innocent. The girl shrugged, finally lowering the weapon in her hands. Well, that lady didn't seem to think so. Besides, she did tell me it'd take a bit to kick in and would be kind of slow. That's why I was trying to. The girl's speech trailed off, but Izuku could guess what she was going to say. Trying to kill me before I became dangerous. He shivered involuntarily, remembering the knife hovering above his head just a few minutes ago. He couldn't blame the girl though, since she obviously believed that her life hung in the balance. Still, her hesitance to take action was a testament to her good character. She had probably had a large window of time in which to attack, but hadn't. Izuku sincerely hoped that it had been a good decision on her part. As long as we're here together, we might as well introduce ourselves. Izuku forced himself to stand, leaning partially on the wall behind him. I'm Midoriya Izuku, but you can also call me Deku if you'd like. The girl tilted her head slightly, a look of curious puzzlement on her face. Deku? But doesn't that mean Dash? Seemingly thinking better of the comment, the girl switched to a less offensive line of speech. Well, I guess I'll call you Midoriya then. Izuku waited a bit in strained silence for the girl to give her name, but when no introduction came, he decided to start up a conversation on another topic. He needed some sort of distraction, or he knew he'd revert to thinking about his encounter with the women from earlier, something that he'd rather pretend never occurred as long as there was nothing he could do to change it. So, how long were you here before I was? He questioned awkwardly. He had never been good at conversing in tense situations. In this room? About an hour, I think. In the facility in general. At least a week. I think they keep people like me around for when they have people like you to train. They told me a while ago that I wasn't going to get out easy, so I'd kind of accepted it. Even if I can kill you, I think they'll just use me for someone else. Well, that line of conversation had turned depressing fast. Just as Izuku was thinking that maybe talking wasn't the best idea, a question came from an unlikely source. You were a hero in training, right? The girl asked, her face neutral as she went to sit on the room's only bed. That's what they told me anyways. Yeah. He nodded. I still am. That comment earned him an almost pitying glance from the girl. Anyways, I wanted to know what it's like. At a hero school. I'm quirkless, so I couldn't really ever even dream of doing what you did, but I've always been curious. Izuku felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. He knew all too well what it was like to be seen as useless for not having a quirk, and it seemed as though she had similar aspirations to his own as well. It's very exciting but dangerous too. My class in particular has had a lot of run-ins with villains, and the workload is crazy too. Even with all of that going on, it's still more than worth it though. Everyone there is so talented and dedicated, you're pretty much constantly surrounded with amazing people, not to mention how rewarding it is to know that the work you're doing is going to help other people someday. The girl got a somewhat wistful expression on her face as she listened, though it disappeared once Izuku stopped talking. She wedged the knife between the mattress and the bar of the bed frame next to her before settling in and pulling the thin sheet on top of the bed over herself, both claiming the space as her own and ending any chance of further conversation in one fell swoop. This left Izuku to sleep on the floor, which though uncomfortable wasn't difficult considering how tired he still felt. The next day came with a new set of challenges other than boring small talk. Though Izuku had formerly denied that he felt any effects of the women's quirk, it was becoming much more difficult to believe. Though it was hard to place, he certainly felt off. It was the kind of nagging feeling he usually got in the back of his mind when he wanted to do something but couldn't quite place what. As if his mind certainly felt the need to perform an action, but had never done it before then, so it didn't know quite how to phrase it. Then the intrusive thoughts came. When he looked at the girl he shared his cell with, he involuntarily began to size her up as a potential threat. The thought process usually came back to the idea that the girl was defenseless and easy to dispatch, going into detail on the ways he could do so, highlighting how simple it would be to snap the girl's neck or slit her throat. Izuku even occasionally got to the point where he rationalized the action. The girl was going to die one way or another, he might as well make it quick. He came back to his senses every time, but each felt more delayed than the last, not to mention how horrified and anxious he felt afterwards. He'd never be able to forgive himself if the girl was hurt by him at all, much less if she was killed. He wanted to warn her, but at the same time worried that it would cause her to be even more worried. The only time the two had talked since the day before was when the day's lunch had arrived through a one-way slot in the door. The food was of a bland, unidentifiable variety that was likely bought due to cost-effectiveness. Since there was only enough portion for one person, the two had been forced to talk in order to sort out how it should be split. Despite the girl's insistence otherwise, she had ended up with the majority of the food while Izuku had only eaten a measly portion. Considering the initial defensiveness that the girl had shown, she mellowed considerably over the course of the day. Every so often, Izuku would even see her sneaking hesitant glances at him as though she had something to say that she couldn't manage to articulate. When Izuku had finally lost all hope of hearing whatever it was she had to say though, the girl finally spoke up. "Hey Midoriya." She began shyly. "You know, earlier when I said that I only guessed you were a hero in training because of what that lady told me? I wasn't really telling the truth. I saw you during that televised event your school held." Izuku wasn't really surprised to hear this. After all, nearly the entire country watched the broadcasts, and he had been stopped in public multiple times due to others recognizing him. Why the girl had acted as though it was some sort of secret was the only confusing part. "My mom and I watched it together actually. We used to get together every year and make a big event out of the whole thing. We'd pick our favorite students, cheer them on as loudly as we could, and bet on who would win. My mom would put so much effort into it that it was a blast whether or not our picks actually made it. I think she did it because she knew about how much I wanted to be a hero but couldn't." The girl paused, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. "Watching it this year was pretty much the same as always, but I enjoyed it a lot more for some reason. When your grade was going, I didn't know who to root for at first, but after a bit I settled on you. I think it was because you seemed like you couldn't really use your quirk right, but you still tried so hard. You even won the race portion all by yourself. To me it almost proved that someone who didn't have control over their quirk, or who didn't have a quirk at all, could still be a hero. After that I seriously thought that maybe if I was just determined enough, I could really do it." Izuku was genuinely shocked. His goal as a hero had always been to help others, and by being such an inspiration to even one person he felt that he had already succeeded. He had often dreamed of having fans, but the experience was so different in real life, especially knowing that it had meant so much to the girl. Someone who had had an experience almost exactly like his as a child had found their determination based on him. It was unbelievable. He wanted to show his gratitude, but didn't really get the chance since the girl hadn't finished talking. "I practiced every day after that, getting stronger even though I didn't have a quirk. Someday I wanted to be brave enough to fight criminals and keep the peace. My dad, he died in a mugging when I was really little, so I always wanted to stop stuff like that from happening to other families. It was tough at first, but I got pretty good at it after a while. I had to do it behind my mom's back though, because if she knew I was putting myself in danger she would have told me to stop. So I went to a dangerous part of town to run laps and told her I was hanging out with friends. That's when I got taken." She was sniffling a bit now as well, rubbing her sleeve across her face to catch her tears. "At first I wanted to be brave, but when I saw it was you who they said was going to kill me, I couldn't fight you. But I didn't want to talk to you either, because that would just make it worse, so I was rude to you, but you're just as nice as I expected you to be, and I wanted to tell you that before I have to go." "No," Izuku said suddenly. "You aren't going to go anywhere. If I get dangerous or try to do anything, you have to stop me, okay? I'll die before anything happens to you, all right?" The girl shook her head feverishly through her tears. "No. You're so much more important than me, I'd never have really amounted to anything anyways. Look, I'm a hero. If I couldn't protect a little girl like you, then I'd be failing to do what I know is right. Please, for my sake, even if you don't mean it, promise me that you'll make sure you survive." The girl collected herself for a minute before replying. "Fine. But I don't really mean it." Izuku nodded. That would have to be enough for now. Tired out by her outburst, the girl climbed into bed and placed her head on the pillow, signaling for Izuku to start trying to sleep in his spot on the ground. He was almost asleep when the girl spoke again. "My name. It's Ima." If the pain had been difficult to cope with before, now there was no other word for it than unbearable. Though the first 2 days in captivity had been littered with signs of what was to come, Izuku couldn't have ever prepared for the current level of mental strain he was experiencing. From nearly the moment he had woken up that morning, his consciousness had been filled with nothing but the impulse to kill. He felt overwhelmingly tireless, and at first it was impossible for him not to pace his cell. However, the first time his eyes met with Ima, he immediately regretted the action. Instead of gently persuading Izuku to fulfill the command, his instincts were now unrelentingly forcing themselves to the forefront of his mind, a seemingly endless torrent of orders all aimed towards the purpose of murder. In order to stop himself from giving in, Izuku had seated himself in the furthest corner of the room from the girl's bed. With his eyes facing the wall, it was almost possible to forget her existence entirely, though he was always just a bit too aware of his cellmate when he heard a noise behind him. Even small noises like breathing, footsteps, and the rustling of sheets echoed in the enclosed space, leaving Izuku in a constant cycle of response and repression. The strong inclination to move was ever present as well, and though he tried to keep entirely still, he could feel himself shaking with the effort. Though he assumed Ima must have been awake by a certain time mark, he ensured that he never looked over his shoulder to tick. While they had conversed quite a bit the day before, the girl must have noted Izuku's behavioral changes and realized it was better to leave him be. The longer Izuku went on, the more the impulses pushed other thoughts away. After a few hours, Izuku had forgotten almost everything but the compulsory need for violence. Broken down to the point of mere instinct, it was extremely difficult not to turn and give in to the command, but every time he began an attempt something would stop him, though at that point he had no idea what. There was simply a pressing intuition at the back of his mind that convinced him to hold back, but it seemed to weaken with the passing of time. Eventually, inhibiting the impulse would be unthinkable, and then nothing could stand between it and its attainment, but it seemed as though Izuku was ready to fight it until the end. Ennui had not expected the current turn of events, though they had seemed to have worked amazingly in her favor. Instead of snapping and immediately slaughtering his first scheduled victim, the subject had instead insisted on prolonging the inevitable. He had allowed her the best of what he was offered, openly conversed with her, and even found that she respected him. That would only make the unavoidable snap more difficult to forgive later on. Based on prior observation, Ennui had found that her commands usually had about 4 phases. The first was the most basic. It was characterized by a vague feeling of need, usually one that was as easy to ignore as an intrusive thought. Before the subject had experienced the fruition of the action, the notion would be formless, more of a baseless suggestion than anything else. This was the stage that most subjects lived in perpetually, since it was the most comfortable and best resembled the way a subject's cognition behaved prior to receiving a command. This phase would last about a day before dissipating. The second was slightly more intense. This phase invoked a greater calling to the command and gave it more form, but was still able to be forgotten or rejected. As conveniently as the first, it also lasted for a 24-hour PRD before falling to its cruder form. Phase 3 was more instinctual and gritty than its predecessors. By erasing any and all complicated thought, the command brought basic instinct to the forefront of the consciousness, making it impossible to ignore. The brain also began to work towards creating restlessness within a subject, making them more nervous and anticipant of the action as well as heightening their senses to allow easier fulfillment. At this point, if a subject gave into the command, their method would be much less controlled than it would have been otherwise, as the subject is only focused on completing the task and disregards outside complications or humanity. Of course, it was a small mercy compared to what would occur were the event further prolonged. The final and most brutal phase was silently referred to by Ennui as the breaking point. This phase was the most chaotic, and as such always occurred at a different time per subject. Regardless of the subject's purpose or command, the subject would go into a super heightened state in which their bodies would spike with adrenaline. All thoughts disregarding the action would be repressed, and the body would essentially put all of its energy into performing the task. Ennui had found that when repressed beyond this point, the subject would expend all of their vitality in trying to complete the task without sleep, food, or water, and eventually die. Of course, no subject had reached this point due to negligence. Ennui, curious regarding the extent of her ability, had practiced her quirk on a subject in the past and placed them in a position where it was impossible to fulfill their command in order to record the results, and had been fairly pleased with the outcome. If at any point during the course of the system a subject were to give in to the command, it would reset back to phase 1 and repeat indefinitely. As far as Ennui had tested, there was no way to remove the effects of her quirk, and since none of her clients had ever complained or asked for a return, she assumed it was impossible. Based on camera footage that she had been monitoring in between appointments, Ennui was certain that the subject in question was currently in phase 3. He certainly seemed restless, and every time he heard a sound behind him it seemed as though only mental effort was stopping him from attacking his cellmate. Ennui guessed that the girl's insistence on alerting the subject of her presence was hardly helping matters. When Ennui had arrived at work at 7 that morning, the girl had already been attempting to approach the subject. At first Ennui had believed that her pursuit of the boy's attention originated from ignorance or morbid curiosity, but at this point the whole thing seemed more like a death wish. The girl had moved in a circle around the room multiple times, tapped the frame of the bed, and even quietly spoken the subject's name as the day went on. When the cell's daily meal had arrived, the girl had only taken a few bites before pushing it across the floor towards the boy. For some reason the girl appeared to believe that the boy would have a much easier time of the whole ordeal if he just killed her, already having given up on her own escape. Despite all this though, the subject seemed completely oblivious. Ennui was shocked to see that anyone could have such strong willpower, though she was certain he would eventually crack. It didn't even matter if she had to wait until phase 3, she knew she was going to get the result she had planned for. Ennui was then unexpectedly jolted from her thoughts by a loud noise emitting from her laptop. Upon checking the screen, she realized that the perpetrator was a video call originating from an unknown source. Ennui was tempted not to answer, but knew that a direct call to her business account was likely to be a client. Of course, such things were usually handled by the sales department, but she wouldn't be surprised if something had been redirected to without prior warning. Her suspicions were confirmed a second later when a text message flashed across the screen of her smartphone. Important client wanted to speak with you. Don't screw this up. Line is secure. Yep, that was certainly someone from the sales department. Short, to the point, and providing just enough information to cause a sense of dread. Ennui sighed and took a second to tuck a few stray hairs back into her ponytail and straighten her posture. Despite majoring in psychology, she had never particularly enjoyed talking to others, especially those in a higher position of authority than herself. She braced herself and clicked the answer button, plastering a fake smile across her face for effect. Hello, this is the Masquerade's lead conditioner speaking. I was informed you had questions about our services. Despite the pretense of a video call, the other line had chosen to one-way block the video feature. That meant Ennui's face could be seen, but she couldn't see the face of her client, yet another downside to communicating on behalf of the company. Yes. I apologize for the anonymity of this conversation, but you'll likely recognize me by name of my association. I'm currently speaking to you on behalf of the League of Villains. Ennui's blood turned cold. Not only a one-way video call from a client, but one which involved one of Japan's most influential criminal organizations. She couldn't help but feel that the whole thing was rather out of her depth, but then she recalled the request of the particular client in question. This was the group that had asked for Izuku Midoriya, her current favorite subject, and if truth be told they were the ones willing to pay about twice as high a price as the average client. Oh, I assure you it isn't an issue. Ennui responded easily, changing her tone of voice to fit a more friendly expression. Are you curious about our process or simply about the subject's state? I should be able to clarify everything for you either way. If I'm being entirely honest, I doubt the authenticity of your services. Before my colleagues and I devote any time or effort to this project, I would like to be sure of its value. Though it was recommended in high regard, I find it difficult to believe that your method is fail-safe. Ennui nodded amicably. She was always willing to give a rundown of her process regardless of her audience. If I recall your request correctly, then you requested that the UA first-year student, Midoriya Izuku, be captured and conditioned for use as either an assassin or soldier. You specified that you, in particular, required that the subject was to be conditioned for violent behavior. Whether to make a statement or for intimidation purposes was left unspecified. Regardless, our conditioning branch recently captured the subject as made obvious by recent media coverage and has begun training. Your request is made possible by the help of specialists in our facility who possess mind-altering quirks, though we can't expose specific details due to policy. Our process has never failed previously, even on the most resilient of subjects. If you don't trust our word, we can introduce you to previous clients who have given permission to be listed as such. They'll all tell you the same thing. There was a slight pause before the client spoke again. I suppose I'll just have to trust you then. I have one more question before I leave. I'm certain you are aware of the effect of recent media coverage regarding your company. You are being researched much more thoroughly than in previous months, and it is likely that professional heroes are likely to show up on your doorstep any day now. For my organization, this indicates that time is especially of the essence, and it is imperative that we know when the transaction is ready to occur. Anhui had to stifle a frown from her face at the words. It was true that her company was playing with fire, but she didn't intend on being burned anytime soon. I estimate that a transaction will be possible in about a week minimum. Of course, it may be possible to cut this time in half, but with mixed results. In the past, most clients have provided a month for training, but these are unique circumstances. I trust that you'll be capable of adjusting to any complications that arise from early dismissal of the subject, though we won't be held accountable as per our contract. Fine. You have 4 days from today to prepare before we arrive for pickup in the aforementioned spot. Please be punctual in your DLVY. After that, the screen went entirely black, and Anhui was finally able to slump down in her chair with relief. For days. She could find some way to work with that. Maybe. She just had to think over all her actions from now on more carefully. Her thoughts were cut by the buzzing of her phone on the desk beside her. Oh, for crying out loud! She exclaimed angrily, picking up the phone. Who could it possibly be now? Caller ID indicated that it was one of the surveillance officers, a guard like Vex who checked cameras and inhibited subject movement when it became unstable. She answered reluctantly. Even if this conversation went poorly, she'd be able to blow off a bit of steam on an inferior. Whatever this is, it'd better be important. She grumbled fiercely, tapping her manicured nails against her desk in anticipation. I'm not having a good day. Ma'am, I just thought you'd like to know that one of the newer subjects, Izuku Midoriya, finally seems to be active. Anhui dropped her phone onto the floor as she swiveled her chair back to face the camera feeds. Surely enough, the boy had stood and turned to face the other side of the room while the girl, shaking and terrified, stood a few feet away. Despite the defensiveness she had exhibited during the beginning of her stay, she was now utterly defenseless, standing in the room center without a weapon or object to hide behind. Her face held some sort of stubborn resolve, and with a sigh of relief, Anhui realized that she didn't plan on backing down. Things were finally moving forward. It was difficult to discern which phase the subject was currently in, be it 3 or 4, but either way there was no turning back. He still had a bit of determination left in him, obviously, since he'd only been staring at the subject as of now, but the calm wouldn't last. Surprisingly enough, however, the girl began to speak as though she believed she would still be heard. Okay, Midoriya. I can tell that this is really painful for you, and I don't want to be the reason you feel hurt. I've thought this over, and I know I said I'd try not to die, but I want to end this whole thing. I think that you can get out and still be a good person, but I can't get out at all, so the girl choked back tears, causing Anhui to roll her eyes a bit at the overdramatic tone of the situation. I don't blame you for anything that happens. And even if you can't hear me right now, I want you to know that I'm so sorry for doing this. The subject advanced a bit. Just a step, but still it was progress. The girl across from him flinched, but her overall stance didn't shift. And if you can hear me, there's something I want to ask you to do. Another step. Please tell my mom what happened to me. And another. I want her to know that I tried my best to be brave. The distance was closing fast. One more movement and she'd be a goner. Thank you for caring about me until the end. It happened all at once. A punch hit the girl, accompanied by a loud crack that Anhui could only assume was her ribcage based on trajectory. The girl looked as though she wanted to cry out but was too winded by the attack. Her face was contorted into an expression of pained shock as she fell back against the wall. Then something occurred which Anhui could only assume was the beginning of the breaking point. A flurry of punches aimed seemingly at random hit the girl, breaking bones with each impact. This part of the job was always rather brutal and gory, but Anhui had more or less inured herself to its effects. Worse still, Anhui was aware of genuine expression of joy on the subject's face. It was part of her quirk's nature that the subject would enjoy the commandment's fulfillment in the moment, but that didn't make the situation any less disturbing to view. Even someone as used to the sight as she was couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust. It was necessary for results, however, so she was able to turn a blind eye. Anhui knew the boy's consciousness would reset phases at the exact point of the girl's death, and by then it would be too late to reverse the damage. Izuku felt ecstatic. He wasn't quite sure why, but it was as if his entire existence prior to that moment had consisted of agonizing pain and energy, but then, as if by some miracle, the feelings that had been so tormenting just disappeared altogether. The experience was comparable to finding out you got a perfect grade on a stressful test, drinking water for the first time after a day of dehydration, or realizing that something dreaded like a roller coaster was in actuality thrilling and wonderful. It was the most elated and relieved he had ever felt in his entire life. At least until his senses returned. The first thing he noticed was the liquid on his hands. It was too thick to be water, and it smelled metallic. When he looked down to investigate, he saw that it was a dark red color. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the ground lay a corpse made nearly unrecognizable by the bruises and blood which covered it. Both arms were bent in ways they shouldn't be, and the neck was turned to an impossible degree. Izuku knew who it was instantly. Aima. His voice sounded harsh and airy, the single spoken word was filled with shock and disbelief. Izuku immediately turned away and hurled what little was in his system on the floor beside him. The scent of blood began to mingle horribly with the stench of vomit, and the world spun. It felt as though every sensory intake was too much to handle, and was filled with the chaotic longing to be anywhere but where he was. He covered his eyes and turned away from the sight, unable to stop himself from gagging once more. He could feel the blood everywhere, it was as if the walls were closing in around him. Aima's words kept replaying in his mind. The innocent, sweet little kid who had had no quirk and wanted to be a hero above all else. The kid whose family always supported their dream despite its impossible nature. The kid who had come so close to achieving their dream but had been brought here instead. That kid had died in a brutal, horrible way right before his eyes, and he hadn't even had the decency to say goodbye. He had been happy about it. Izuku ran to the door and began to hit it with full power. He knew his bones must be breaking, but he didn't care. The door, made of some impossibly strong reinforced metal, merely began to dent, and now his knuckles were bleeding, but he couldn't feel it. All he knew was that he had to get out. Away from the mangled thing on the floor a few feet away. Suddenly some sort of force encapsulated the air around him in a bubble, separating him from the door and what minuscule chance of escape he had. The force field cut off all the air around him, and he could feel himself slowly suffocating, but still he struggled to break free. Eventually the air did run out, and he lost consciousness, a feeling both welcome and unwelcome at once. Then everything fell away to darkness. So, are things still on schedule with the Midoriya kid? Anhui sighed and nodded lightly, shuffling a stack of documents into her purse. Surprisingly enough, yes. It's taken a lot of effort and resources, but I believe that he'll be ready for release by the end of the week. She purposely neglected to mention the fact that she didn't have a week to prepare the subject, knowing that it would only serve to irritate her coworker. Though most of the burden of subject's training fell to her, the conditioning expert had found that it didn't stop others in her company from fretting over the training as well, especially when their paychecks were equally dependent on its success. The current peer in question happened to be a subject surveillance and repression worker, which despite allowing plenty of chances for observation of merchandise didn't seem to do the best job of entirely sating subject-related curiosity. End of the week? That's a bit less time than these things usually take, right? You sure it'll go okay? Anhui felt her brow knit in irritation as she responded. I haven't failed a task in the past and I don't plan on doing so now. If you think it prudent to doubt my abilities, then you may as well resign from your position now, seeing as the fate of this entire business rests in my hands. The women knew the comment was unnecessarily biting, but it was difficult for her to remain polite when under both stress and scrutiny, and her pride wouldn't allow her to admit her misgivings either way. The retort was met with a surprising amount of repentance on part of the younger employee, evident in both the blush that crept to her face and the nervous way she bit her lower lip. Sorry. I didn't mean to seem doubtful of your abilities, you've always done so well in the past after all. I'm just counting on the bonus from this sale is all. Not that you should feel pressured or anything, Anwi. I mean, I'll be okay either way. The girl trailed off, her eyes flitting restlessly to the floor. Anwi was always pleased with the level of reverence and fear the newer employees displayed around her. It was wonderful to have a reminder of how intimidating she could appear. Speaking of which, you're on the surveillance team, aren't you? Anwi asked, though she had in truth already known what the answer would be. Since this particular meeting was taking place in one of the building's elevators on the morning before a workday, she could easily pass the idea of having forgotten her co-worker's identity. She found treating others as if they were below memory to be a fine power play, and it seemed as though pulling rank wouldn't hurt if she questioned the girl about something as risky as she was planning. Yes, I am. Kato AI, codenamed Ward, at your service. The girl's enthusiasm was draining to say the least, and Anwi couldn't help but figure that it likely originated from a longing to climb the corporate ladder. What a kiss-up, she thought, tilting her head to roll her eyes away from the youth's view before facing her once more with a sweet expression. That's terrific. That would mean you're the girl who can create long-distance force fields, correct? Your response to the possible crisis of the Midoriya case was highly admirable. It's no wonder you're so invested. Anwi was referring, of course, to the boy's breakout attempt upon the death of Ueda Aima. Though his reaction had proven to be satisfactory, the accompanying rampage was not. Anwi had been forced to hire a costly professional with a healing-oriented quirk to fix his injuries afterwards, not to mention the price of reinforcing his cell door several times over. Though he was difficult to accommodate, it was no wonder the League of Villains had their eyes set on the green-haired student. Of course, even his quirk hadn't been able to stand up to the incredible repressive effects of Ward's field. Her quick response as well as her effectiveness had no doubt earned her a permanent spot in the group, a fact which slightly irked Anwi. Thank you. I'm just glad someone as important as yourself took notice. I'm willing to help as long as there's money to be had. Good. Anwi commented inwardly. Then this will be easy. It's funny that you'd mention that, because I just so happen to have an opportunity open to you which could result in a pay raise if done properly. The girl visibly perked up, her eagerness at the idea of increased pay poorly concealed. Are you willing to take on a bit of extra work? Yes, of course, ma'am, was the girl's immediate response. Just tell me what you need done. Anwi considered her words carefully, worried by the possibility of her request's rejection. Have you been working the main monitors often as of late? She prompted, deciding to present the task in as roundabout a manner as possible. Yes, from 8 in the morning to 12. The employee replied amicably, stepping lithely off the elevator just as its doors began to part. Anwi followed closely after. Despite the fact that her office occupied a lower floor. After that, Watanabe Renzo's shift begins. But I'm sure you already know that, so I'll assume you were inquiring after the level of attention I've been paying to the kids in the cells. She looked to her superior for confirmation, and Anwi granted her a swift nod. I notice a lot, I guess. It's hard not to when they're my only real form of entertainment. Can't help but feel sorry for some of them, but hey, it's natural selection, I guess. The girl's words were accompanied by a haphazard shrug. You gotta crack a few eggs to make an omelet. I'm sure you feel the same, right? The girl hardly paused to listen for a response before continuing. Basically what I'm saying is that whatever job you have in mind for me, I'm more than willing regardless of how dirty it is, so you can quit beating around the bush. Anwi wanted to be annoyed by the blunt way of speech as well as the assumption of the purpose tasks inherit immorality, but at the same time she welcomed to opportunity to get the whole thing over with. Fine then. Since you say you've been watching the subjects closely, then I trust you've noticed Midoriya Izuku's recent progress. I've been sending quirkless fodder in at a fairly consistent rate for the past 2 days, and though he took his time with the first 3 or so, the more recent candidates haven't lasted more than an hour. Normally I'd be pleased with results like these, but at the same time he hasn't spoken since the first death, and hasn't eaten any of the food we've been sending in at all. Though Anwi hadn't been quite finished speaking, her companion took the pause as invitation to comment. You worried your plans for this one worked a bit too well, huh? It's true it's a bit off, but not completely unprecedented or anything. Plenty of kids react like this at first. Besides, I'm sure the clients won't care if he's a bit off as long as he does what he's told. Anwi had to bite her tongue to keep from sending back a harsh retort. Certainly. But that's not exactly the issue here. I'm concerned more by the fact that the progression of my psychoanalysis of the subject is hindered by his lack of verbal activity. The girl turned and shared a knowing expression with her. Oh yeah, that whole pet project thing you have with behavioral analysis. Quill might judge, but I won't. We all have our hobbies. How exactly do I fit into this though? I'd like to speak to the subject directly to get the data I need. I haven't gotten permission from the higher-ups, however, and I don't really have the time to request something so unorthodox from the higher-ups at the moment. Because of this, I can't access the cell intercom to speak to him, and would need to go to his cell myself. Of course, this would be a death sentence without the proper protection, not to mention that I'd need a blind spot in the camera footage to operate in, both of which I believe you can provide. Despite her earlier insistence, the girl seemed taken aback. That's pretty dangerous, you know. My quirk may be strong, but even it has its limits. You saw what that kid could do, right? And all this just to satisfy your curiosity? The two had arrived at the entrance to the security room where Kato was stationed, though the girl stopped in front of the door to address Anwi further. If you get yourself killed, the company loses one of its most valuable assets. We literally can't operate without you, you know. Anwi quirked one eyebrow and let her tone shift to a more threatening one. If that's a no, then I suppose I can ask another officer to help me. It's your money lost, not mine. She pivoted without another word, hoping the bluff would be enough to coax her coworker. There were no sounds other than her polished heels against the hardwood floor until suddenly, fine. I'll do it. Anwi walked back to the employee, a look of subtle victory encompassing her face, though it was gone as quickly as it had come. Thank you. I'd appreciate it if the cameras went dark around 10 today. Replace the missing footage with whatever you think will seem convincing. She slid a wad of cash into the girl's open hand before heading back to the elevator. Though the conversation had gone sour sooner than she expected, she was grateful at least to know that monetary manipulation hadn't worn out its uses. It was one of the few benefits of working beside criminals after all. To say that Izuku Midoriya had had a difficult week would be the understatement of the century. Ever since he had first woken up from his frenzy, it seemed as though he was living through some kind of sluggish nightmare. Surprisingly, he found things much different than they had been when he'd fainted. The walls and floors were clear of blood, and his arm and hand had somehow been miraculously fixed. Even the sheets that covered the thin wire frame bed in the corner of the room showed signs of wash. It was almost as if the events of the last day had never happened. But of course that was just wishful thinking. Not soon after he regained consciousness, the newly finished cell door had swung open to accept a new occupant, and Izuku had experienced an overwhelming feeling of dread. They expected him to do it again, he'd realized. And again. In fact, it was probably the only thing he would be allowed to do for the rest of his life. Though the cell's new visitor was a slightly older male, Izuku couldn't help but be reminded of Aima, especially when he chose a thin switchblade off the rack to defend himself. At the time, the green-haired boy had also silently noted that either Aima's knife, or a near replica, had been placed back into its spot as well. When his new cellmate began to ask questions, Izuku provided no answer. He had learned his lesson from the first experience after all. It was clearly better not to get attached. It didn't help much that it seemed as though their captors had neglected to inform his cellmate of even the most basic of information, though it did give some insight into the idea that Aima's level of knowledge hadn't been per the norm. She had been informed of the situation, it seemed, merely to necessitate conversation between the two inmates. He guessed that it was ordered by the women Izuku had met directly after his capture, and though he usually found it difficult to foster hatred for others, he found that she was an exception. It wasn't long before the inclination to kill returned, this time much stronger than the last. It seemed that since his mind now knew what it wanted, it was much more difficult to ignore. With it came the same thoughts, but this time with a cruel twist. With each command he was reminded of the intoxicated feeling that had accompanied a kill, making the idea even more tempting. At first he had been determined to keep the new cellmate alive as he had failed to do with the last, but eventually he lost hope for the goal when he realized that his mind was intent on repeating the same viscous cycle of need as before. Since he was certain he couldn't stand to see another person die in the same manner as Ima, he had chosen to rid himself of the need early on rather than allow himself to slip back into a more dangerous state. Though the boy had tried to fight back, he really hadn't stood a chance against someone with a quirk, and Izuku tried to consider it a small mercy that at least his death was quick and relatively painless. As the day continued, yet another person was sent to his room, though he disposed of them even quicker than the last. Though it both disgusted and frightened him, he found it uncomfortably easy to complete the task when he imagined the people as numbers rather than living beings. It was a gruesome method certainly, but also likely the only thing standing between him and insanity. Every time a kill was preformed, he told himself that it was for the best, ignoring the reoccurring image of Ima's nearly unrecognizable corpse as it flashed across his consciousness. He was becoming increasingly capable of convincing himself that what had happened to Ima was nothing like what he was doing now, though even his delusions seemed to weigh heavily on his mind. When what he recognized as night had come and another kill had been made, whoever was overseeing his progress finally repented. No more children were sent inside, and he had been able to lay down on his spot on the concrete, waiting for a sleep that wouldn't come. No matter how much time passed in the cell, Izuku was determined to avoid using the bed. The comfort wasn't worth the memories it would bring back to light. The next day followed in the same manner for the most part. Another day, another parade of faceless, nameless prisoners to send to the slaughter. But then surprisingly enough, the earlier constant entourage of victims disappeared right before the time when Izuku's meals were usually delivered. He wanted to take it as a good sign instead of a bad one, but couldn't help but be pessimistic in light of his new situation. His suspicions were confirmed when restraints composed of the same translucent energy he had seen in the bubble from before encircled his wrists and ankles, tethering him in place at one edge of the cell. He wasn't sure quite what to expect at the time. Was he being sent to whatever client had been spoken of earlier? Had he angered his captors in some way? His questions dissolved as soon as a familiar face opened the cell door and entered the room. The woman he had seen earlier, tall, well-postured, and as arrogant as could be with her dark black hair kept in the same tight bun and dark almond eyes looking down on him from behind bright red glasses. The thought came to mind that he'd love to snap those glasses about just as much as he did the neck of their owner. "Hello, Izuku. I see you're still doing as well as ever." There was a glassy mocking air to the woman's voice, and it was obvious that the use of his first name was meant to be disrespectful. For the first time since the command was given, Izuku was actually eager to follow it. "How are you feeling?" Izuku couldn't help but think that this was some kind of sick joke. Whether or not the women had been keeping track of his activity, he was sure she already knew the answer to her own question. It was just a matter of degrading him further. Instead of gracing her with a response, he instead grit his teeth and gazed off at a random point to his left. "Still not speaking, are we? I'd love to say I'm not concerned, but then I'd be lying. I need to assess your mental state for reasons regarding your cell and accompanying release. The faster you answer, the faster I can send you off." The words were obviously meant to provoke some kind of reaction in Izuku, but he had found it hard to consider release since he had learned about the nature of his new lifestyle. Being set free at this point would be even worse than captivity, since outside he would be urged to kill almost anyone he looked at. He couldn't return to school, and there was certainly no way he would let his mother see him like this. Besides, the freedom the women was offering was no doubt conditional. Whoever he was sold to obviously wanted to use him as a weapon which could hardly be better than his current existence. The women seemed displeased but not at all discouraged. The way she behaved seemed to scream, one of us is going to cave eventually and it won't be me. Now Izuku couldn't help himself from imagining her as a bloody stain on the floor. Look Izuku, we both know that my promises count as virtually less than CRP to you, especially after what I've done, but I'm going to need you to speak for the sake of your classmates if not for yourself. It took him a moment to process that information. His classmates? Then he remembered. It had only been about 5 days ago by his count when he had first met with the self-proclaimed psych doctor and been told that they had captured his friends as well as himself. He had yet to see any proof, yet the idea still made his heart skip a beat. Fine, what do you want? He croaked, his voice hoarse from either misuse, tension, or both. The women smirked victoriously before pulling a black pen and pad from her purse and readying them for use. I'd like to ask you a few simple questions is all. Even her voice was touched with an air of precocious arrogance. The first being one I've already asked. How are you feeling? Izuku's brows knit inadvertently. The question was as useless as its answer was likely to be, so he spared no time in answering it. Like sheet. Next question. The woman shook her head, a slight grin on her face. Try again. And answer in a few more words this time. I can't sleep, I can't bring myself to eat without throwing up, and I'm in a perpetual state of wanting to brutally murder everyone I see. In summary, I feel like dying. He nearly growled, putting as much venom into the words as he could muster. This earned him a smug smile and a few hastily scribbled lines in the women's journal. Wonderful, that actually happens to lead right into our next question. If you feel like dying, then why haven't you yet? Once again Izuku felt himself stop to carefully consider the women's words. Why wasn't he dead yet? At this point he really didn't have any reason to continue on. His dreams of being a hero were ruined, he couldn't return to anyone he cared about for hope of hurting them or worse, and he had 7 deaths on his conscience to boot. Only a few months ago he had considered jumping off his middle school's roof just after some teasing from Bakugo, so what was stopping him from giving in now? It wasn't as if he hadn't had opportunities with all the kids who had fought back. Many of them would have gladly slit his throat. Yet he hadn't let them. He almost immediately regretted the level of consideration he was giving to the women's question, yet at the same time. Maybe I think there's still hope for this condition to be removed. He answered, though he could hear his own dismissal of the idea as soon as it was spoken. Even if he got better, it wouldn't help him forget Ima. Please be honest, or I can't promise your peers' safety. The women reminded him, writing in her notebook all the while. Deep-seated, cold hatred welled up in Izuku's mind, and then he had the answer. If you want honesty, then you'll get it. I'm still alive so I can kill you. There was such a tone of merciless animosity to his voice that even the women across from him seemed to shrink back in fear, her pen dragging uselessly across her page and dropping to the floor before she regained composure. Thank you then. I think that's all I'll be needing for today. The woman stammered, her face still colorless as she turned to exit the room. She stalked out of the room, in her hurry forgetting to pick up her fallen pen. After the door had closed behind her, the bindings around Izuku's limbs faded until he could move again. Things resumed as normal with another child being sent in, but this time things were a bit different. He knew the woman was watching and he intended to make a display for her. After a much more messy kill than all previous ones neglecting Ima's, Izuku dipped his hands into the resulting blood and flicked it over each of his room's camera lenses. He knew they would clean them, but he didn't care. All he wanted to do was make sure that whoever had put him here would regret being born as soon as he got out. Aizawa Shoyuda had had one hell of a night, especially considering that it should have been a night off. Instead of scaling pitch-black rooftops, trailing criminals of unknown origin, and texting coworkers at ungodly hours of the night, he had been given the perfect opportunity to simply sit at home alone with a microwave dinner before getting in a surprising 8 hours of sleep. Fortunately enough, however, for once, he hadn't had the good sense to mind his own business. It had all begun with the so-called lead a few of Aizawa's students had shown to him a few days before. The entire thing had been built around some incredibly loose and baseless comment posted on an outdated internet thread, but he had humored the teenagers for the sake of their own well-being rather than his own. Much of Class 1A had neglected sleep, study, and training until they were ensured that at least some development was being made in the Midoriya case, even if it was as flimsy as what they had eventually provided. Of course, Aizawa would be lying to himself if he said that all his interest in the case was based on the whims of the class. As much as he loathed to admit it, he did care for his students, and he couldn't help but blame himself for the entire situation. In theory, things would have gone differently if he had made it to the alleyway on time, if he had watched after the class more vigilantly, if he hadn't planned the exercise in the first place. But more, perhaps, than anyone else, Aizawa Shoyuta hardly saw the value in dealing in hypotheticals. He had looked into the webpage due to minor curiosity despite his initial disbelief, and surprisingly the results were much more than he could have hoped for in a best-case scenario. Whoever the porcupine quirk wielder the original poster had mentioned had a profile on the site, which when checked, had never posted to a traceable thread. Though it did appear, in fact, that the user had been linked on multiple pages in the past, always responding to someone who claimed to need a guy. The profile itself was fairly empty, with no pictures, names, or ID to speak of. Even the username was simply composed of 4 consecutive X's. Without a warrant, there really wasn't any hardcore tracking to be done. After all, Aizawa was hardly a hacker, and even in the case he had been, any actions on his part would have been illegal. Luckily, the criminal was sloppy enough that nothing of the sort was ever required. Since it seemed as though past clients had simply private messaged the account, Aizawa assumed it was at least worth a try as a first method. By creating a quick and equally ambiguous account, he had managed to send a simple message which read, "I'm interested in hiring." He had practically jumped out of his seat in surprise when he received an almost instantaneous response reading, "Okay. Anything you want to know first?" The whole situation seemed far too good to be true. Here was the supposed culprit of a highly successful human trafficking scandal offering him information on a silver platter with no prior exchange of info. No one could possibly be that stupid. Of course, Aizawa knew from past experience that people could indeed be that stupid. He took a second to think of the most likely question a real prospective buyer would ask, then typed accordingly. "How much for a job?" seemed accurate enough. "Depends. What do I have to do?" was also similar enough to the expected. There was a moment's pause. This next question could be risky. It's sensitive. Is there a location where I can discuss details face to face? Aizawa held his breath in anticipation until, sure. Sato's Sushi in Shibuya. It's public but everyone there's too busy to eavesdrop. It'll have to be 7 p.m. tomorrow. The pro hero didn't know whether to be relieved or appalled. "Fine with me. See ya then." Aizawa had stepped back from his personal computer, still dazed from the digital conversation. Everything had fallen into place far too easily. Either he was being set up, there was more than one morally dubious porcupine quirk holder in Japan, or he had just been given everything he needed on a silver platter by the very person who had created the necessity. After a quick survey of hero-accessible citizen quirk census records, Aizawa was once again left in shock by the fact surveys recorded no citizen with the described quirk, meaning that either every holder of a similar ability had also felt the need to go off record, or there really was only one in the country. In either case, the lead was worth chasing. Aizawa had informed a few co-workers of his plans for safety purposes, but had also emphasized the fact that the lead was likely to bear any change negative or positive on the case at all. Even so, he couldn't help but be a bit hopeful at the thought of the solution to a majority of his current problems being so easy to obtain. The day of, Aizawa didn't fret too much over disguises or possible public recognition. Unlike most of his colleagues at UA, he found that he was rarely ever noticed when in his civilian attire, which was all the better for him. To be sure, he did wear a hoodie, but either way he doubted there would be an issue. The encounter had gone extremely smoothly as well. Since the criminal's quirk was his identifying trait, it hadn't been difficult to spot him at his table. As expected, the man was a complete airhead. Though extremely arrogant in his abilities, he became casual extremely quickly, and was hardly observant enough to realize the care his companion took in hiding his face. Over the course of half an hour, Aizawa managed to confirm not only the fact that the man in question belonged to the human trafficking group, but its name as well. The thing he found most amusing, however, had to be the man's closing sentence, spoken after more than one drink. See, bet you wouldn't believe it, but no one else involved knows I advertise like this. The head honchos call me careless, but my fines account for at least 30% of our clientele. Aizawa had agreed at the time to placate the man, but found it hard to suppress an eye roll. Though he wouldn't doubt the man's combat ability, he certainly shouldn't be let near any potential buyers. After that, the two had supposedly parted ways, though Aizawa had trailed him for quite some time afterwards. It was unclear whether it should be taken as astonishing or evident when the man's car pulled into a parking lot on the wrong side of the city rather than a place of residence. When the culprit entered an unsuspecting-looking building a few blocks away, Aizawa had no doubt in his mind that he had found the man's place of work, if not the very building where Izuku was being held. After taking sufficient pictures of license plates and addresses, he had contacted those involved in the case and presented his information. With a bit of recollection, it was found that his account of the person in question matched the student's own descriptions to a T, and before long there were plans for further investigation, and even talk of a full-scale attack being launched on the facility. After all clues were found to point in the direction of the area in question, it was eventually decided that actions should be taken as soon as possible. Due to the supposed scale of the business in question, it had been decided that any attack would be withheld until the morning of the next day to allow for foreplanning. Assuming that the group still held many of the missing persons on record, special care would have to be taken to avoid a hostage situation. The attack would have to be quick, precise, and relatively stealthy, meaning that Aizawa was almost first chosen to participate. He didn't mind the trouble at all if it meant finding Midoriya, though he had to admit he wished he'd been a bit more prepared for the night ahead. He was currently back at the UA dorms, having decided to tell his class about the infiltration beforehand since it likely wouldn't be televised for the sake of discretion. He figured updating them on the case was the least he could do considering that their efforts, regardless of how minute, were what had made the rescue possible. Besides, he had things he had to pick up from his office before meeting up with his coworkers either way. Surprisingly, he had found multiple students awake upon his arrival. From the dark circles and yawns, he could guess that despite the recent reinstatement of a regular school schedule, many had been finding it difficult to sleep while their classmate was in direct peril. It didn't take much time to assemble everyone in the common room, and from the looks on the students' faces when the news was declared, few of them minded the interruption of their sleeping schedules. Even Bakugo, who was normally irritable about any unforeseen development, failed to provide a single utterance of complaint. Though he did pose a rather negative, interesting question. "If I were any of you, I wouldn't be so excited," he declared in a tone which managed to be both pretentious and melancholy. A whole week has passed since Deku was caught. Even assuming that he's still in this mystery group's facility, we have no idea what's happened since then. He could be dead or worse. The change wasn't immediate, but after a pause the majority of the once upturned faces in the room began to turn crestfallen. While Aizawa himself had considered such a turn of events, it wasn't shocking that the students themselves had neglected to focus on that sort of scenario. Though a good ward to bad thoughts was optimism, the outlook often paired well with falsely held ignorance. "No," a steady voice from the back of the room asserted. "Midoriya may be kind, but he certainly isn't weak. I know he may be injured, but I'm certain he isn't dead. He's too strong to let anyone break him regardless of skill." The owner of the voice stepped forward, revealing himself to be none other than the normally reserved Todoroki. The pronounced look of clarity on his face left no room for argument regarding the statement, though it didn't seem like anyone other than a still straight-faced Bakugo was willing to contradict. The other students seemed to regain their pep, and soon enough, Aizawa was leaving the campus with a surfeit of encouraging remarks and displays of good faith. Still, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmingly negative about the endeavor he was about to undertake. Nothing about this sat right with him, but still. At least there was some hope, he supposed. Though the killings had still been extremely difficult for Midoriya Izuku to cope with, he found that an end goal made it all much more bearable, especially since he now knew he'd be leaving the group's captivity sooner rather than later. Recently, someone who Izuku could only assume was the brainwashing quirk holder had been sending in subjects with the intent of preservation rather than destruction. The first such subject had entered the room much more confidently than their predecessors, and instead of going for the weapons rack immediately like most, had tossed a letter across the floor. With no better course of action to take, Izuku had picked up the paper with the intent of reading. The stationery was the very same he had seen strewn across the office of his overseer, and the curt but uniform style of writing would suggest a similar conclusion to its origins. The letter, phrased in fewer words rather than more, had informed Izuku that if he were to spare the next 3 children sent, they would be removed from his cell after a PRD of 3 hours and allowed to remain alive for an extended PRD of time in comparison to their predecessors. Oddly enough, Izuku hadn't exactly known how to respond to the letter. On one hand, of course, he felt relieved. Ever since the killings had began, he had been wishing for a way out of their continuation. The action of killing in any capacity was certainly and irrevocably wrong, and he was sure that every person who had entered his cell in the past had possessed cherished human connections, hopes, dreams, and aspirations which were just as valuable, if not more valuable than his own. But still, Izuku had begun to realize some time ago that whenever he felt guilt for his actions, it was difficult to picture anyone other than Aima. The thought was disturbing to say the least. Out of tens of dead children that he himself had killed, he was only capable of feeling any sort of emotion for one. Not only was the lack of recognition unlike him, but in Izuku's mind it couldn't be read as anything other than unforgivably inequitable. Each face, each name, and each person deserved to be mourned, grieved over, and dwelt on as much as the rest, and as the one who had killed them, no matter how willingly, it was Izuku's job to ensure that they were. Soon enough, however, Izuku realized why he had developed such a strong emotional detachment for those that he had no name for other than victims. The more he thought about the past lives of the dead, the guiltier he felt, and the guiltier he felt, the less motivation drove him to continue on. In a strong moment of clarity, it had occurred to him that the more he allowed the killings to remain in his mind, to fester in consciousness, the less likely he was to retain what semblance of sanity he had left. The mind that had once been praised for its empathy and compassion was now set to be destroyed for its merits, and thus they had receded in the manner of some compulsory defense mechanism. No matter how much Izuku wanted to feel for the nameless corpses he left in his wake, time was making the goal nearly impossible. And Izuku wasn't quite sure which curse frightened him more: the killings themselves or the monstrous apathy they seemed to construct within him. One day, fresh after a killing, Izuku had attempted to muster up some sense of regret or remorse for what he'd done, but after coming up blank, his theory was confirmed. Almost like the way a person's body was apt to adapt to fit a quirk, Izuku's mindset had adapted to fit his new lifestyle. In a crazed attempt to feel something, anything, for the lives he had ended, Izuku had taken Aima's knife and laid a solid red gash across his arm. Infuriatingly enough, however, not even the physical pain of the wound had felt real, more like a distant throbbing than the sharp sting he'd hoped for. At that point he'd wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't even come to his once exasperatingly tear-prone eyes. He'd felt yet another stab of horror at the realization that the inflicted cut had been deliberately benign rather than fatal. After everything he'd done, he should feel remorseful enough to want to die, shouldn't he? Yet still he clung to life like a dull beacon in an impossibly endless storm. Earlier he had told himself as well as his captor that he'd been remaining alive simply for the sake of revenge, the cruel satisfaction he knew he'd find if he managed to return the pain he'd been forced to suffer tenfold back on its benefactress. Of course, that might as well be the reason. After all, his hatred for the women had only grown more inexorable and fiery with time rather than less, and though he felt loath to admit, he often daydreamed of her demise. The dream, however, lost much of its draw when he came to the realization that he wanted revenge for himself rather than his casualties. Once again he was forced to face the hideous truth that the human lives he'd taken, once so invaluable in his thoughts, had turned from existences to numbers. Though the cutting became a regular practice, it still seemed to only solidify the unachievable nature of the emotions he sought. Now, as the temporary escape from such a deplorable existence was being offered to him on what was practically a silver platter, he felt nothing but numbness and the silent stir of the still ever-present urge to murder. Well, actually, those weren't the only emotions. Though the numbness was awful, Izuku had concluded, the more potent sense he felt upon reading the letter was disappointment. Izuku might have laughed had the recognition not been so sickening. The exact point of time when Izuku's command was fulfilled, as his captor had explained, he was supposed to experience an extreme rush of dopamine. He could only conclude that that was the cause of the thrilling burst of happiness he felt during a kill in spite of the grueling disgust which preceded it. In the short span of a few days, that rush had become the strongest emotion he seemed to be capable of feeling, and no matter what his consciousness might scream, a louder and more primal part of him demanded more of it. The whole thing was about as dreadful as it was ironic, the thought that he might actually be addicted to inducing death. He complied with the letter as much to save the 3 people in question as well as prove to himself that he could, though the process was a bit more difficult than he'd anticipated. He didn't even require his instincts to push him on anymore, and the slow normalization that the action of murder had worn into him almost felt like first nature. He kept reminding himself that the boy in the cell with him was just as real and important as one of his friends, as important as Ima. This manner of thinking was surprisingly tethering, and Izuku was thrilled by the idea that his friends still held just as potent a force to him as they had before. He was certain that as soon as escape was possible, his first action would be to find and free his friends, hopefully without them seeing what he'd become, before he'd set off to kill the dark-haired women. Of course, a small part of him hoped, at the same time, that the women would be capable of removing her quirk beforehand. She had seemed selfish enough that Izuku could imagine a plethora of painful ways to coerce her into helping him before he ultimately ended her life. Once he realized the morbidity of that train of thought, he had set it aside, but the idea of being free of the quirk as well as the cell was far more than enticing, and if it was possible, it wasn't too far off in the horizon. The attempt on his captor's behalf to control his killing instinct led him to believe that whatever buyer was lined up to collect him planned to do so soon. It wouldn't exactly be a sound business practice to allow a product to exterminate its users soon after purchase. Though Izuku acquiesced, he couldn't help but be angered by the fact that his actions likely followed the predictions of the dark-haired women. He detested the thought that his actions might give her any form of satisfaction, but still tried to ease the resentment with the promise of her future erasure. Eventually, after the promised 9 hours had come and gone, Izuku was once again assaulted by the hazy barriers that had restrained him during his incinerator's brief visit. As expected, the restraints were followed by the approach of 6 fairly threatening-looking guards, 2 of which were sent to lead him out of the cell door by his immobile arms. At the same time he exited the room, he felt a myriad of alien sensations. One was the shock of the hall's unnatural lights on his eyes, something he knew he really should have been prepared for. After spending so long accustomed to the near-complete darkness of his room, he feared that looking any luminescent room or surface for an extended time PRD would be painful for a while. The other feelings were those he could only attribute to attempted restraints on part of his surveyors. From an onslaught of general ill feelings, Izuku was able to pick out an identical feeling of nausea to that which he had been afflicted with days before. Whoever was in charge of his transportation was really pulling out all the stops. He didn't know whether to feel proud of his ability to frighten the dark-haired women or afraid of himself for the self-same merit. Eventually, after entering an elevator and doing quite some walking, the guards halted in front of a door Izuku didn't recognize. It was a large and foreboding structure that looked more ornery than functional. He wasn't sure quite what to expect when the doors opened, but it certainly wasn't this. As the decorated pieces of wood parted, Izuku found himself staring face to face with Kurojiri, a key player in the League of Villains' recent attack on UA. Izuku felt a knot in his stomach. Now he knew for certain he may have jumped out of the frying pan, but a much more perilous fire was fast approaching. Kurojiri hadn't quite known what to expect from Masquerade. As far as other criminal organizations went, his past experiences hadn't exactly been reassuring. But regardless of whatever doubts he had felt before, he couldn't deny that the boy standing in front of him was a far different one from the one he had briefly encountered during the attack on UA. Besides the obvious change of appearance, there was something obviously darker and more foreboding in his demeanor as well. The boy's unkempt and disheveled hair and clothing may have been attention-grabbing, but the teen's most striking feature by far were his eyes. From what Kurojiri could remember, the green-haired student's eyes had once been wide, happy and hopeful, displaying determination and excitement in equal turns. Now they seemed to be less animate than a toy's, though far less friendly. The surprise the boy should have felt upon seeing one of his school's rivals mere feet away failed to show on his face, and the cold stare which Kurogiri received felt piercing and somehow murderous. Unlike the vibe of a happy-go-lucky go-getter Kurogiri had begun to anticipate, he felt as though he was meeting the lifeless glare of a monster. He suspected that whatever the members of Masquerade had done to the boy had been as violent as it was evidently effective. "Midoriya Izuku, would you please step forward and take a seat?" The man seated at the desk behind Kurogiri motioned to a chair by the foot of the room's entrance, his voice managing to feign politeness even in its forcefulness. The green-haired teen complied, seating himself in a position that suggested he was even less comfortable with the situation than he looked. As he moved, he never took his eyes off Kurogiri, his hands poised in tense fists at his sides. "I can assure you that this is the subject you requested. Midoriya Izuku, male, age 15, strength-enhancing quirk, and former student of the UA Academy for Heroes. We've fulfilled our end of the bargain by delivering him to you physically unharmed, still in possession of a quirk, and willing to comply to the set demands. You requested that he be trained to be serviceable and inclined to commit actions which constituted the breaking of the law and which would be great enough in scale to earn him the title of villain despite his age. Both requests have been followed, though we must warn you that our programmer took some liberties in achieving this goal. As per the nature of your request, we can promise that Midoriya Izuku will be more than eager to perform the act of first-degree murder, a crime which when done on a large scale will assure one receives the legal title of villain. He may, however, be difficult to manipulate and control, and it is advised that those in charge of his well-being solidify a surefire form of physical restraint in case of backlash." Kurogiri studied the boy and found it difficult to doubt anything the man claimed. In a rather twisted way, the Masquerade had held up their end of the deal spectacularly. But at the same time, Kurogiri couldn't help but feel a strong pity for the former student known as Midoriya Izuku. He wasn't sure that even Shigaraki could achieve such a look of suffering in someone as the one the boy was currently displaying. "I certainly believe you," Kurogiri agreed with a nod. "But I'd like to be clear on exactly what manner of backlash you're referring to here." In truth, Kurogiri was sure he could guess. He did, however, require a bit more stalling. He had expected Toga to have already set off the building's alarms knowing her insatiable lust for combat, but unfortunately she seemed to be running a bit late. That is difficult to say," the man confessed, his voice still smooth despite his indecision. "I'm afraid that telling you more would breach client-provider confidentiality." "I'm not afraid to say." Kurogiri turned his head sharply to once again face the boy in his chair. It seemed as though his words had caused him to double over as soon as they left him, however his mouth didn't stop moving regardless. "If you keep me around I might just end up killing you. They made it so I can't help it. This awful woman here has a quirk that does it. Something called command, I think." Kurogiri understood every word of the boy's speech despite the evident touch of pain. He looked to the advertiser for a reaction and was hardly disappointed. The man's face was bright red, mouth reeling in silence. "Thank you," Kurogiri replied, looking at Midoriya as he did so. "Is there anything else I should be aware of?" Before Midoriya could move to answer once more, a blaring alarm began to wail across the premise. Finally," Kurogiri exclaimed in an even voice. "I'm afraid that's our cue to leave Midoriya." The boy looked up at Kurogiri in apprehension before suddenly, his transparent bindings began to fade. Soon his focus turned from the villain in front of him to the cuffs around his feet, which he then broke almost effortlessly. "What is this?" the man behind the desk demanded incredulously. "You aren't trying to skip out on payment, are you?" Kurogiri nodded his head still turned to face Izuku rather than the marketer. "I'm afraid we didn't exactly have the capital to follow through on our fees. We do, however, have the force to ensure that it shouldn't be a worry. Trust me, Midoriya, I'm certain this arrangement will work out just as well for you as it does for us in the long run. In the meantime, would you mind dispatching this man for me? I'm afraid I'm more of a support unit than a combat one." The boy just nodded his head, an oddly hopeful smile playing on his face. "Sure. But only if I get something out of the deal." If you let me set the other captives here free and save a particular employee for me, then I'll do whatever you need me to. Kurogiri was shocked by the easily met demands but couldn't do much other than agree. Of course. Could you please describe the person to me so my cohorts and I know who to confine? Midoriya was grinning now. I don't know her name, but she's about 180.34 centimeters by my best guess. She has long black hair, but it's always tied up from what I know. She should also be wearing a suit and pencil skirt. Then consider it done. I will inform the rest of my accompaniments to detain, but spare, the women in question until you've been to see her. Since there was apparently nothing else to discuss, the boy walked over calmly to the man in question and dispatched him as asked. The event was a bit more gruesome than required, but Kurogiri was already seeing how well Midoriya Izuku could fit into his new role. Afterwards, the boy departed from the room in an almost giddy manner, waving at Kurogiri as he passed by. Kurogiri wanted to be puzzled by the whole exchange, but really couldn't risk any more time on such thoughts. He had more villains to transport to the premises after all. No one with a position in Masquerade could be left alive to give others any idea of the origin of Midoriya's new nature, otherwise the overall plan would become immediately less effective, and it was one that he knew Shigaraki was far too excited for to let go to waste. Izuku could tell that he was essentially skipping down the halls of the building but really couldn't bring himself to care. Soon enough his captor would be dead and his friends freed, and he didn't really mind whatever happened afterwards, even if he did have to accompany the League of Villains in the future. The instant gratification of his daydream scenarios coming true was far too overpowering to think of anything else, and besides he always had the fail-safe plan B of simply dying if his reality became too hard to face. Or at least that was what he told himself. Some of the rooms he passed were occupied by busy League members, though he barely spared them a passing glance as he headed for the elevators. Since the floor in this area was made of wood and the one containing the holding cells concrete, he guessed his destination was the ground floor. He punched in the correct number with a shaking hand before descending. He wasn't quite sure what he'd do if and when he actually saw his friends. Luckily, the kill from moments before had tided him over quite a bit, but the thought of encountering one of them in his current state was still terrifying. Besides, what would they think once they found out what he's done? At the very least, they'd dislike the fact that he was working with villains to set them free, and the promise he'd made to return afterwards. Of course, he still didn't know for sure if it was a promise he planned on upholding. When the elevator opened with an encouraging ding, Izuku was met with familiar surroundings. Cells were lined up on either side of the hall, each with an identifying document pasted crudely to the door. Izuku tackled the problem of opening the doors as best as he could, by using a low percentage of his quirk to blow them off their hinges. Luckily, it seemed as though all of the lower floor guards had been called elsewhere when the alarm sounded, leaving him to his work. When children poured out of the cells, they looked at him not with gratitude or excitement as he'd hoped, but rather fear. Most ran for the stairs or elevators immediately after their escapes, though a few lingered to stare. Izuku didn't want to acknowledge those terrified looks, didn't want to think about who they were directed at. He hoped he just needed a good shower, but was uncannily sure that it was something else about him that sent the kids running. Soon enough, Izuku had passed through the entirety of the floor with no sign of a familiar face on a door. Is there another floor with holding cells? Or was I lied to? Izuku was glad that he knew the truth to be the latter. It gave him yet another reason to bash in the brunette woman's skull. He made his way quickly back up the stair, but was halted unexpectedly when he saw Himiko Toga waiting at the top of the first flight. "Hey Izuku-en," she greeted nonchalantly. "You've got to go see that woman before Dabi burns this place to the ground, so I suggest you come soon." The blonde took off down an adjacent hallway, leaving Izuku with no option but to follow. He found her waiting on rocking heels in front of one of the unmarked rooms, blood splattered across her peach sweater. "Here she is, I caught her for you. She was just putting some papers into a briefcase and I locked the door on her. Have fun." Izuku ignored the girl's blatantly cheerful commentary and took a step into the room. Sure enough, there the woman was, cowering behind an upturned chair. Cowardice, SDSM, and disregard for life all in one package. It seemed that Izuku wasn't going to find any shortage of disgusting qualities here, a fact he didn't mind at all. Look, I know exactly what you're thinking, and I can assure you you'll find no benefits in killing me. The desperation in the woman's voice gave it a frantic quality, one which wasn't helped by her harried breathing. There's absolutely nothing to be gained for you here. Izuku narrowed his eyes, taking a step closer to the women. She backed away in turn. Fine then. Tell me the benefits of keeping you alive, because right now I'm not hearing a compelling argument. His words came out in a growl, something he'd thought himself previously incapable of. The women flinched back at his words, but began rambling on nonetheless. I am a highly accomplished mental programmer as well as a decorated psychologist. I promise you I can help whatever group you're joining immeasurably. I can provide dash. No. Izuku cut the women off mid-sentence, shocking her into silence. I don't care about the league. I want to know how you can help me. The last word came out a bit more assured than he'd meant it to be, but it was effective regardless. Why you? She stammered, her voice quavering. She scooted back a bit further, legs shaking. Well, there isn't much I could do for you specifically right now, but I'm sure dash. Izuku cut her off again, this time intending to use authority in his voice. Stop dancing around the subject. Can you or can't you remove the effects of your quirks? And don't lie. I'll know. It was a bluff, but the answer was obviously honest. No, I cannot. I've never been able to. Now, after all the time spent praying for some emotion, Izuku began to feel himself cry. As much as he had told himself he was prepared for this was not what was supposed to happen. He was meant to remove the quirk. He wasn't meant to spend the rest of his life in a vicious cycle of killing and despair. He had been so close to being a hero. So close to impressing the people he looked up to making meaningful friends, to making a difference in the world. And now it was gone. Just like that. Before he even knew what he was doing, Izuku had rushed forward and grabbed the woman by the throat, pulling her up off the ground. The ensuing scream was deafening, but Himiko didn't come in to check on him, so he supposed it was fine. You'd better rethink that answer. He demanded, his words steady despite the hot tears pouring down his face. You get 3 minutes. The women clawed at his hands, but even her generously long and sharp manicured nails didn't cause any feeling. He was sure he was being cut, but it didn't matter. After a few moments of struggling, the women finally stopped, turning her large, panicked eyes to look down at his face. If you kill me here, then you really will be a villain, you know. She managed to utter. Wrong answer. At this point I already am, and I'm not even sure I can bring myself to care. Izuku threw the women against the wall as hard as he could, satisfied by the sound of breaking bones. He felt the telltale rush that meant a kill had been performed, and took a few minutes to savor the feeling before exiting the way he'd entered. Toga followed carelessly behind him like a lost puppy, and he could feel her ogling at the blood splatters on his uniform. He simply ignored her as she joined him in the elevator, pressing a button he remembered to belong to Kurogiri's floor. He passed numerous corpses on his walk, but failed to notice that a large fraction of them belonged to the children he'd previously set free, due to the fact that he was either too absorbed in thought or too deep in his autopilot to look. By the time he reached Kurogiri's room, it seemed as though all the villains had vacated the premises except for a disgruntled-looking Dabi and the portal-manipulating villain himself. So, you've decided to enlist. Kurogiri stated. A choice you won't regret. If you would join Miss Himiko in returning to base, I would be most appreciative. We have a bit of work to finish up here before we go. Izuku nodded numbly, entering the portal without argument, a delighted Toga bounding in behind him. He only caught a whiff of smoke before the darkness closed around him. Hey, Mr. Suzuki? The police officer muttered urgently into his microphone, attempting to hopefully catch the attention of his boss back at base. Yes. What's so important you had to interrupt my meeting? We have professional heroes here to help. The underling ignored the blatant annoyance in Superior's tone, continuing on with his report. You told us to monitor all entrances to the building in question and warn you, but this isn't exactly a traceable entrance or exit. A loud sigh traveled over the phone, followed by a question. Fine then. If it's not someone entering or leaving the building, then what is it? The covert officer nervously wrung his hands together, knowing that his next sentence was likely to anger his correspondent. Well, you see, based on the amount of smoke coming up from the building in question, it seems to have spontaneously caught fire. Despite this, however, no one is visibly exiting the premise. The groan that ensued afterwards confirmed the lower officer's theory. Well, my luck's sheet. Guess I've got to tell these heroes to call off their mission. It's really too bad that this lead turned fake. I heard it had something to do with all those missing kids. Despite the lack of visual communication between the two, the officer on site began to nod his head. Yeah, it's a real shame for sure. In retrospect, Izuku wasn't quite sure why he'd decided to uphold his promise to the League. He had considered numerous possibilities already since stepping out of the portal, all of them making at least a decent amount of sense. The first was the most rational. The building was about to be burnt down and was infested with villains besides, so it wasn't practical to stay or defy an enemy with an obvious advantage both numerically and strategically. Though he could have slipped away unnoticed before his visit downstairs, he'd felt the trip necessary enough not to feel any regrets in taking it. Afterwards, he'd been closely watched by Toga, and though he would have gladly fought her, she likely would have been quickly backed by her accomplices. The second was still understandable. He'd been shocked and dazed based on the events of the day, too much so to think in a level-headed manner when presented with a difficult ultimatum. After all, he had killed someone a little less than 10 minutes before departure. No one could have judged him for being a bit out of things. The murder, on the other hand, well, he'd rather not think about that. The third and last possibility somehow managed to be the least intelligent yet most likely option of the three. In this line of thinking, knowing he had nowhere to go, Izuku had made the choice to ally himself with someone, anyone, rather than go alone to face the trials he knew were in his near future. Without someone's help or guidance, he knew he'd end up on the streets, running the risk of eventually meeting with someone from his old life and revealing what he'd become. There was also the concern of what he'd do out in the world unsheltered. The only path he could really see himself going in from this point was that of a serial killer, which was somehow even more horrifying than being a villain. At least when he was with the League, he'd have some direction or purpose. Besides, Kurogyari had seemed willing enough to negotiate back at the facility, with any hope Izuku would be able to talk the group out of pitting him against someone from school, or God forbid All Might. That certainly wasn't a pleasant thought. Izuku had wondered why the League of Villains wanted him specifically among the choice of all his classmates, and the strongest argument he could muster was that they had realized he had come to inherit one for all. Some time ago, when the villains had kidnapped Bakugo, the thinking behind it had been a bit more obvious. He had explosive temper, excessive pride, and a fairly masterful control of his powers, so it stood to reason that he would make a good, if not willing, criminal. Izuku, however, possessed neither of those traits. His ability to control his quirk was volatile at best, and he was perhaps the most mild of all his classmates. Or he had been, he supposed. Either way, it didn't make much sense as to why he of all candidates would be chosen to make a mockery of UA. Until you factored in his possible connection to All Might. Seeing Izuku turn sides would likely not only ruin the reputation of the heroes involved with his schools, but add insult to injury for a now relatively powerless symbol of peace. Izuku had already felt responsible for being a less-than-ideal successor, especially considering all the more worthy people he knew had been proposed. Now more than ever, he was positive that his elevation of status had been a complete mistake. Now he was entirely unfit to carry any heroic title, much less that of his idol, but the fear of being a quirkless nobody again was too strong to allow Izuku to admit he needed to find a new recipient for the power. Izuku found his actions driven by a selfish purpose, and still he was unable to shake them. It wasn't that he had been entirely selfless before by any means, but at least he had been able to do what was right for those he cared about. Now he wasn't even capable of that. As soon as he'd emerged, he found himself in a warehouse not unlike the one that had been wrecked in the attempt to save Bakugo. It was large enough that Izuku couldn't see the walls clearly, and the only light that shone in was through gaping rectangular windows perched just below the high ceiling. Industrial-sized metal shelves were lined up at intervals across the floor, and a catwalk hung eerily above. The whole place gave off a very ominous feel, especially since the moon outside cast such long shadows on the building's contents. Izuku was a bit startled to realize that this was his first time seeing the sky, through windows or no, in at least a week. He desperately wanted to walk outside to feel the fresh air, but thought better of it when he heard Toga step out of the opening behind him. "Hello again, Izuku-an," she greeted, stretching out a hand for a casual wave. "Welcome to headquarters. For now at least. We use this complex for meetings mostly, but I'm sure that you'll be staying here somewhere now that you've joined up." Izuku was once again struck by the girl's casual use of a nickname when referring to him, especially since they'd only just been acquainted for the first time off the battlefield. While he would have loved to contradict her, he was a bit too put off by the bloody knives he carried to risk irritating her. Thanks." He hesitated. "Nice." The girl giggled in response. "Yeah, I've always thought it was a bit of a dump, but I'd never say it around Shigaraki if I were you. I guess you might as well though, since something you do's bound to set him off anyways." Izuku shuddered a bit at the thought of seeing the hand-clad villain. While Kurojairi seemed reasonable enough and Toga at least held a bit of an odd fondness for him, Shigaraki was a complete wild card. In all of Izuku's past meetings with the man, he had come across as more than a bit unhinged, and it had seemed as though he hated him almost as much as he hated All Might. Which was hardly shocking considering what they might now know. Toga seemed to take Izuku's silence as an opportunity to walk away, though she stopped to perch herself atop a nearby crate. "The other guys should be back here soon. And by the other guys I just mean Dabi and Kurojairi. The rest of the people we sent out were just temporary muscle, so they'll be sent somewhere else," she remarked. "Then you'll probably get the full rundown. And before I forget to mention, you're not allowed to leave. I guess it was probably pretty obvious already, but we have security cameras and orders to keep you in. If you try to get away, we hunt you down. But if you don't try to leave like a good employee, you get special privileges. If Shigaraki gets it in his head that we can trust you, you might even get to go places by yourself eventually." Izuku could feel the blood drain from his face, but he nodded anyways. Freedom might be close in physicality, but in truth he was still nothing more than a trapped rat. "Don't look so down about it," Toga encouraged, that ever-present cheerful edge to her voice. "I promise most of us here don't bite, and even then it's only the good guys." It felt as though the last statement was almost a direct attack on Izuku, but he grinned if only to shut her up. "Thanks," he quipped, this time coating his voice with a bit of false warmth. "I'm sure I'll be fine then." Though the line had been a bit difficult to deliver, it seemed to satisfy the blonde, who began to focus on wiping her knives clean rather than making small talk with her prisoner. Izuku, who was quite comfortable with the ground at this point, sat on the floor rather than joining his companion on a crate, leaning up against a pillar for a bit of support. With nothing else to do, he pulled out Ima's knife and studied it in his hands. Unlike Toga's weapons, the blade was fairly small, boasting a grip small enough to fit the hands of a child but a reach long enough to ensure it could still do damage. Izuku was a bit proud to still feel a deep sense of remorse when he looked at it, though it wasn't quite enough to bring tears to his eyes. He was shaken from his thoughts by the echoing sound of heavy shoes on concrete, and swiftly slid his sole belonging back into his pocket before turning his head to view the new visitors. Though Dabi had entered the room first, Kurojairi was not far behind. Izuku couldn't help but feel the urge to sprint away as both of the criminals' eyes focused on him from the center of the room. Unsure of what to do, Izuku simply rose and began to walk over, stopping a yard or so in front of the two new arrivals. Toga quickly followed, walking with an oddly lithe grace before joining the others adjacent to the green-haired boy. "Firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming along so politely," Kurojairi addressed. "My sincerest apologies for the brutal methods which we used to procure you. You must understand it was necessary for your freedom." "My freedom, of course," Izuku muttered sarcastically, having regained some of his confidence after thinking back to his time in entrapment. "Because, as Toga was nice enough to inform me, I'm not actually at leisure to leave, am I?" Though Kurojairi had the decency to look taken aback, his two companions had much more amused expressions on their faces. "I suppose I should apologize for that as well. I'm afraid that what you've been told is true, though it doesn't have to be forever. We'd certainly like to build this alliance on trust and mutual benefit rather than force, But if you insist on being stubborn, we may need to resort to more unaccommodating measures. Hopefully, however, we can come to an agreement to your liking on what exactly you'll be doing as a member here, and then things won't be as tense. Can we work it out now then? I'd like to get this out of the way soon if I can. Izuku declared, crossing his arms. It shouldn't take long if you're half as competent as you'd like me to believe. Toga let out a small giggle, and Dabi gave Kurogyari a look that could only be read as, "Can you believe this kid?" The older villain ignored both and simply continued with his negotiations. Yes, that would probably be best. What would you like to know first? Our expectations for you or your living arrangements? Expectations, if that means you tell me what my job will be. Izuku retorted, maintaining the same overconfident air as before. Yes. Well, your duties here will be divided into parts proportionate to your time spent here. First, we'd like to solidify your public status as a high-profile villain in our service, meaning that you'll need to commit a crime great enough to be televised with enough substantial evidence to prove you were the culprit. We'd prefer that this statement has something to do with heroes, though it doesn't need to be anyone high-profile. I was told that you would be more than willing to kill on command. Why, yeah. Izuku choked, putting a hand against Aima's knife through the fabric of his pocket. Actually, there's a bit more you should know about that, I guess. I sort of have to kill someone every 24-hour PRD. Well, technically it's more like a 72-hour PRD, I think. But if you want me to be all there, then 24 is best. I'd prefer it at least. Though Dabi looked fairly disbelieving at the notion, Kurogyari nodded thoughtfully. That can certainly be done, he assured, never taking his eyes off Izuku's. But once again, if you're going to participate in a kill, we'd prefer if it were heroes. I'm certain you have some that you've never liked? Some whose ideals that don't adhere to yours? These two idolize Stain, and I've heard he's even fairly popular among those of a civilian nature. If it would be easier for you, I'm sure you could take up a similar mantle. Once upon a time, the idea of imitating Stain would have disgusted the green-haired teenager, but now he wasn't so sure. If he had to kill, then he could make something good of it, for others if not himself. It was no secret that for every admirable hero there were two iniquitous ones, and Izuku himself had seen that in the pro-hero endeavor. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if he took a similar stance, especially if it helped make the world a better place, even in such a twisted way. Fine. I agree to your current terms, he begrudgingly affirmed. So what about my living arrangements then? Well, considering the space available, we have a few different options open to you. Kurogyari began in an even tone. While many of our members have homes outside of our property, you are not one such case. Accordingly, we will house you somewhere here, where we have cameras and staff to keep tabs on you. Izuku rolled his eyes, but the others hardly seemed fazed. Our more elite members have rooms on the premise, and we could arrange one for you as well. You would, however, be in the same hall as those you see here, as well as Shigaraki, which I'm afraid might make you a bit more reluctant to take up such an offer. Izuku nodded. Full offense, but I'd rather not. You might as well mark that one off the list and move on. Kurogyari kept talking smoothly as if uninterrupted. We could allow you to sleep here in the main warehouse. Though it isn't the most comforting of places, it does have a bathroom as well as a loft area where you could sleep uninterrupted. We are using it now for your induction, of course, but otherwise we usually only come here to store things. You'd be far away from most of us for the majority of your day. Then there's also our third op dash. No, here is fine. Izuku interjected rudely. Where's this loft area? Toga, being the most willing of the group, was sent to tour Izuku around the building. Though he had free reign of most of the place, he was advised to stay away from certain areas as well as told the do's and don'ts for dealing with other members. There was a little bit too much information to intake if Izuku was being completely honest, and at one point he began to speculate that Toga talked simply to hear her own voice. He was beyond ecstatic when the two finally stopped at a loft area located among the warehouse's crossing catwalks and was told it would serve as the closest thing he got to a room. Nestled between one corner and a window, the area was a cozy square of functionally lit space. On the grated floor sat a few upturned crates which had been fashioned into a rectangle long and wide enough to serve as a sort of makeshift bed. No one was really sure where you'd want to stay, so I just sorta prepped every option a bit. Toga explained, pointing to the boxes. "I'll go get your blankets and pillows and stuff if you wait a minute." Izuku would have been grateful for the girl's evident care if circumstances hadn't been what they were. After a few minutes of patient waiting, Toga returned with a sleeping mat, a comforter, and a small pillow. "This should be enough, I think," she declared, dropping the contents of her arms on the bed. "Is there anything else you want before I go? I've got to sleep too at some point." In a turn of thought that would have ordinarily been unlike him, Izuku considered coming up with something to send her off for just to keep her up, but in the process realized that there were a few things he actually did need. "If you've got some shampoo, a change of clothes in my size, a towel, a pen, and a notebook, then I'd love to have them," he told her as he arranged his pillow and blanket. "Yeah, maybe. What size shirt are you?" After a bit of communication, Toga returned with slightly too big clothing, a notebook and pen, a worn towel, and a container of half-used 2-in-1 shampoo and conditioner. Izuku thanked her and waited for her footsteps to disappear from his range of hearing before heading downstairs to the warehouse's bathroom. Though the shower was crude and obviously not well maintained, Izuku was able to rinse off most of his collected blood and grime semi-hot water before changing into his new clothes. Despite the wear and tear, he cleaned his suit in the sink as best he could, though it wasn't exactly shocking that the bloodstains refused to disappear. He supposed he'd have to ask someone for a replacement soon, though the idea was bittersweet. After he had finished as completely as he was probably ever going to, he gathered up his things and returned to the loft, taking one more box from downstairs with him to function as a nightstand. After he had arranged everything to his liking, he tentatively laid down on the makeshift bed, finding it surprisingly soft. On second thought, though, he concluded that that might have been more of a byproduct of his past sleeping arrangements rather than a testament to the structure's luxury. Izuku picked up the notebook, recognizing the brand and style as the same type of composition book he'd used during his days in middle school. Instead of making him feel better, the memory only served to irritate him, so he flipped hurriedly past the cover onto the book's first-lined page. His next movement was even more familiar yet somehow less jarring. Izuku clicked the black ink pen he'd been given, and after a few test scribbles began to scrawl out a list of names. If his memory served correctly, then he was writing the names in a specific order, from lowest ranked to highest. He didn't stop until every hero who failed to uphold the values they should by his recollection was written in plain bold print across a corresponding numbered line. Once the table of contents was ready, he turned to the first page and began to note down everything he remembered about its hero, muttering quietly to himself as he did. Once he was done, he lifted his pen from the page to find it hovering over a surprisingly condensed wall of text. "Guess I remember more than I thought I would," Izuku stated to no one in particular, studying his notes. "Well then, I guess whenever they need me to take down my first target, I'll be ready." He set the book on the crate beside his face, sending it one last look of disdain before turning to face the window. "It's okay," he thought to himself as he stared out at the moon. "It's completely fine. These aren't innocents I'm planning to dispose of. They're heroes. They'll put up a good fight and probably kill me. I won't have to have any more deaths on my conscience then. And the League of Villains won't be able to use me for anything else either." At the thought of deaths, Izuku picked up Aima's knife once more in a quick, almost involuntary motion. As blood welled up on his arm, he twisted it against the light, stretching it out far enough that it fell on the grated floor rather than his makeshift sheets. "I'll be dead and gone and won't have to deal with this stupid infinite nothingness ever again." Just as they had during Izuku's first imprisonment, things eventually settled into a predictable, though much less rigorous, schedule. On his first day, he was woken up at some time around 8 in the morning for the purpose of demonstrating his command. Unlike Izuku's past captors, Kurogyari seemed to take an especial interest in the order's nature and limitations. As an experiment, Izuku had been taken out to a courtyard and told to kill a pigeon perched nearby. By Kurogyari's guess, the women's command had been vague enough to allow the death of animals as well, though the green-haired boy was led to think a bit differently. Whether by merit of the conditioning he'd received or the intentions behind the women's words, killing non-human organisms failed to provide the same closure and rush that Izuku would normally feel otherwise. Though Izuku had wanted to feel disappointed by the vain efforts, The outcome of the test had hardly surprised him. The quirk he now lived with had managed to become less of a peculiarity and more of a way of life with passing time, and after the letdown during the breakout the day before, he had come to think that desires to change this unfortunate status quo were doomed to fail. Regardless, though, Izuku still had to reset his command's internal clock, and he told his companion as much. Soon after, the mist villain had somehow located and procured a sedated living person, allowing Izuku to finish the job in whatever way he thought best. The teenager was granted a surprising amount of freedom given his situation, but hardly found it rewarding. The only engagements that were set in stone were the morning killings and midday training sessions, the latter a shocking addition to Izuku as well as a few other of the League's constituents. Around noon, a bit after lunch, Izuku would be called to a fairly open space outside along with another, seemingly random, villain. From there, Kurogiri would monitor and maintain practice fights between the two, giving Izuku pointers and advice as he fought. Though Izuku would have liked to be able to admit that the sessions did nothing to improve his skills, he knew he would have been lying. Over the course of just 2 days, he could feel drastic improvement from the fighting style he had practiced previously, likely due to the fact that he now had a private teacher with an evident reserve of time to devote. The variety of opponents also served to sharpen Izuku's tactical mind, pushing him to create different strategies and fighting styles based on the offensive or defensive leaning of an enemy. While Kurogiri technically oversaw the training sessions, it wasn't unusual at all for another regular affiliate to sit in and give their 2 cents, and after a while Izuku found out each main villain's strengths and weaknesses based on what combat tips they best delivered. Toga was surprisingly analytical and technique-focused, while Dabi was an expert on controlling and rationing power. Even Twice had helpful commentary in the form of feints, distractions, and misdirection. Even when the consultation was hidden in the form of sarcasm or rude jabs, it was difficult not to see some merit in all the information his new teachers had to offer. While Izuku missed the social and often formal structure of UA, the level of attention he received with his skills under Kurogiri was likely a much faster path to combat excellence, not to mention that his other studies were being neglected in favor of physical training. Izuku supposed that the purpose of the classes was to improve his chances of taking down a hero when the time came, but was far too bored with the rest of his day to refuse. When he wasn't practice brawling, he was confined back into the warehouse, a place where there was little more to do than write and occasionally converse with Toga, the latter being a pastime he was hardly fond of. Like with all her peers, Toga held a somewhat morbid fascination for the boy and his abilities. Though it didn't seem to be public knowledge that Izuku's quirk stemmed from all mights, this didn't prevent an onslaught of villains who thought his strength was either cool or fascinating. Combined with his newfound murderous intent, there were practically people lined up out the doors to watch Izuku's daily slaughter, some admiring his skills and a smaller group of more morally gray others protesting the ritual for its failure to uphold the ideals of one idol or another. By the end of the week, Izuku began to feel like he had as many enemies as he did friends among the new crowd, and he wasn't quite sure how to take it. The only person who consistently failed to take an interest in the former hero in trainings actions was Shigaraki Tamura. The few times that the two had met had been tense, silent, and most often the fault of coincidence rather than planning. From the glares that Izuku received from him in passing, he guessed it was likely to remain that way. Though Izuku was hardly on casual terms with anyone in the alliance, it felt as though Tamura disliked him most of all. The single time the two had exchanged words had resulted in the disintegration of the top layer of Izuku's shoulder in response to a rude comment, and the experience wasn't something he wanted to repeat. While providing bandages for the wound, Kurogiri had assured Izuku that Tamura only disliked him due to his former status as a student of UA, to which the other had simply responded that he didn't care. Izuku certainly wasn't there to make friends, least of all with his past nemesis. He barely tolerated Toga as it was, so it would only be increasingly awkward if anyone else decided to act cordially. Though Izuku had thought about escape more than once, it wasn't a longing he had ever acted on. Even ruling out the possibility of being jumped by a villain or caught on camera, he found it impossible to think of anywhere to run to in the case that he did make it outside. Home and school were hardly options, and he didn't have the money to pay for a meal, much less a hotel room. Besides, Now that he knew for certain that humans were the only possible way to reset the women's quirk, he didn't like the idea of being anywhere without a sure source of fodder. Though Kurogyari had informed him that he would have to reveal his new status to the public at some point, he'd rather have a place to hide afterwards in the hopefully unlikely event that he didn't die on the job. He had toyed a bit with the notion of fighting the League as well, but ultimately decided to abandon the thought. It was unlikely that Izuku would be able to fight off so many experienced criminals at once, and after all the trouble they'd gone through to acquire him, it wasn't likely that he'd be killed. The best he could expect was a greater removal of freedom and bargaining, something he wasn't ready to invoke. After a few days had passed, Izuku had grown restless in captivity. Despite his initial longing to prolong an encounter with a hero for as long as possible, he began to feel trapped enough that he would do almost anything for a trip outside, no matter how short. When more time went by with no talk of a send-off, curiosity drove him to finally talk to Kurogyari on the matter. Having posed the question before a training session, the only time the two really saw each other, Izuku received the answer in a quick but precise manner. Apparently there were multiple rational reasons to withhold the teenager's first villain debut, though he found it difficult not to be annoyed as they were addressed. Firstly, though Izuku's new suit was in the making, it still had yet to be completed. Similarly to most things in his current life, he'd been given very little input regarding its inevitable redesign. He was aware that new features were being added but wasn't quite sure what they were, though the secrecy made him suspect the installation of a tracking device of some kind was involved. Eventually, it had been said that the design of his new costume was likely to mimic or at least echo the old one for easier identification, which only made sense since they had confiscated the original under the guise of replicating measurements. Secondly, Kurogyari failed to believe that Izuku was ready for an exploit of a professional magnitude at his current level of quirk mastery. Even if no one particularly cared for his well-being, he was still a resource the villains weren't willing to waste. Much to Izuku's dismay, it seemed as though dying in the line of fire might be more difficult than anticipated. Lastly, there was the issue of trust. Naturally, Izuku had done nothing to hide his distaste for the others, so it was no secret that he would desert if given a secure opportunity. Kurogyari had been speaking to him with false courtesy over the course of his stay in an attempt to lessen his hatred for the group, and though Izuku usually responded in kind, it was more of a facade than anything. Then there was always the planned suicide attempt, but he honestly hoped that no one had guessed his plot to throw his first fight yet at the very least. However the debut went down, it was obvious that Izuku was expected to leave a lasting impression, and no one thought he could in his current state. Begrudgingly, Izuku had questioned his teacher on what he would need to do to speed up the process, though the answer was much less than satisfying. According to Kurogyari, all executive decisions were ultimately made by Shigaraki, meaning that there simply wasn't much that he could do but wait. Even with the minor setback, Izuku tried not to be deterred. With nothing much else to do, he threw himself into training more so than he had previously, reserving pages in the back of his composition book to jot down progress and improvements he hoped to implement in the future. It was oddly satisfying to line up each weakness he found in his combat style and cross it off along with the arrival of its amendment. Sometimes the distractions of the present were effective enough that Izuku found himself forgetting the past. Though he still set time aside to keeping Aima's memory alive, he found himself dwelling on her and his classmates less and less during his daily activities. While this certainly upset him some, he was beginning to think that it all might be for the best. He was starting to think that there was no need to focus on the things he couldn't change, especially when they were accompanied by such harsh emotions, or rather lack thereof. Remembrance without guilt only served to make him feel empty, and it didn't seem as though the guilt would be arriving anytime soon. Besides, in what he predicted to be a week or so, it wouldn't matter anymore anyways. A day or so after his inquiry, things began to change around the facility. The range in which Izuku was allowed to occupy grew, and he soon found that even his curfew had lifted by a considerable amount. Unsure of whether or not the new freedom was a test, Izuku had been tentative in his explorations at first. Though the fenced perimeter of the compound was only barely visible from the warehouse and training grounds, he preferred to stick close rather than wander despite his proclaimed freedom of range. After a while, however, he began to take walks closer and closer to the other side. Once he had even gotten close enough to the barrier to view a street sign across from the gates, something he truly couldn't believe the villains had overlooked with their location being such a liability. He ended up deciding that the placement of his newly available walking path was intentional, a small show on his captors' end to display the faith they were willing to put in him if given the chance. It read a bit like a child's invitation to join a supposedly secret club, and he couldn't help but feel a bit insulted despite himself. Earlier he had drawn the line at being friendly with the others, but if that was what it took to get away as soon as possible, then he figured he'd need to set the bar even lower. Lunch, which Izuku had previously treated as a private affair, suddenly switched to a social event. Though he tried to make his rounds with everyone besides Shigaraki, he eventually found a comfortable balance eating with Toga and Dabi. While the two were an unlikely pair, Dabi seemed to be amused by Toga's antics while she was entertained by his snarky remarks in kind. When Izuku sat with them, he hardly felt the need to contribute, as their interactions were entertaining enough on their own, but forced himself to for the sake of his end goal. Even though he found his comments met with skeptical looks from the fire villain in the beginning, Toga's immediate acceptance of the new guest eventually won out. Though he had to alter his bearing a bit, Izuku became an almost natural addition to the duo. By playing mediator between the two during arguments and providing intellectual insight on points of interest, he made the trio less volatile as well as more prone to reason, his recently adopted realism creating a bridge between Dabi's pessimism and Toga's optimism. Of course, every time Izuku began to enjoy the interactions, he had to remind himself that it was all an act. The people he was socializing with were cold-blooded killers, the worst of society. But even so, they had human traits, and no one was entirely bad or good no matter how things might seem on the surface. There were things to admire along with the things to despise, and sometimes the two went hand in hand. Still, it was easy not to get too attached to the others. Until one night at least. Sometime after dinner, Izuku had been engrossed in noting down the counter to a recent blunder on the practice field only to be interrupted by the arrival of Toga. While it wasn't exactly odd to see her visiting the warehouse, her timing was a bit odd, not to mention the way she was dressed. The blonde, who usually stuck to a somewhat fashionable pastel style during her off time, was currently wearing a wide-beaked baseball cap and loose navy hoodie. Before Izuku could question the nature of the encounter, the girl strode over and plopped down on the floor near his bed, opening the duffel bag she carried to reveal a similarly shady set of clothing inside. Without hesitation, she bundled up the outfit and tossed it to other teenager, standing up and kicking the empty bag to the side afterwards. "Go downstairs and change. Dabi's waiting outside with the car by the rear gate, so be quick or he might decide to leave you behind," she commanded, ignoring Izuku's obvious confusion as she turned to leave. "Wait a second. What's going on?" he called back, but his words were only met with the receding sound of shoes on metal. Though perplexed, Izuku figured that he'd rather do as Toga said than be left in the dark about whatever the pair was planning. At the very least, whatever it was bound to be entertaining. After heading down to the bathroom to change and brush his hair, Izuku walked out to the gate as instructed. Just as promised, Toga and Dabi were on the outside standing beside a fairly beat-up-looking car, the former of whom was waving erratically in his direction. "Hey Izuku-en," she exclaimed, a bright, somewhat creepy grin displayed on her face. "Hop the fence and we'll get going right away." "What? No," he retorted, glancing over his shoulder at a camera attached to wall behind him. "You know I'm not supposed to leave. If I do, Shigaraki will." Come to think of it, Izuku wasn't quite sure what Shigaraki would do in the case he left, but he'd really rather not risk it. "Well, he can't do much if he never finds out," Dabi remarked bluntly. "I'm the one who's supposed to be looking out for you today, and I'm not going to tell. But hey, if you still don't think you have the ball, we might as well just go to Shinjuku by ourselves." Izuku was stunned into silence. It seemed too out of place for these two to be inviting him to do anything recreational, much less to hang around a popular nightlife hotspot. While he had admittedly been bored by his new monotonous lifestyle, he wasn't sure he even deserved to enjoy himself, and he definitely didn't want to run the risk of being caught. But still, "What exactly would we be doing if I were to come?" he inquired, trying to keep his voice as disinterested as he could. "I dunno. Depends on what you want to do, I guess." Toga replied. I like karaoke, so I thought maybe that, but Dabi really hates it. With you along I could finally have a singing partner. Yeah, okay, we're certainly not doing that. But there is a horror movie we both want to see, and Toga said she'd pay for the tickets. Dabi interjected, shooting Toga an exasperated glance. Okay, and then we'll do karaoke. She responded, meeting Dabi's gaze with a falsely saccharine sweet smile. So, you coming or not, Izuku-an? After a moment's hesitation, Izuku nodded, scaling the chain-link fence to fall on the other end beside the vehicle. Fine. But if I get caught, one of you is going to cover for me, he announced, hiding his excitement under a layer of condescension. Agreed. It would be Toga's pleasure. Dabi grinned, taking his place in the driver's seat. Though Toga frowned, she didn't object, and she filed into shotgun as Izuku sat in back. On the drive there, he found himself a bit shaken by the idea that the world he was seeing from the car window was one he hadn't interacted with in at least 2 weeks. He felt so removed from a world that had once seemed mundane to him, and it was especially jarring whenever he saw signs depicting heroes. It all felt far too distant to be real. When they finally did arrive at the theater, Toga found out that she didn't have enough change on her, forcing an exasperated Dabi to pay. Though he promised to hold the event over Toga's head for as long as he could, Izuku suspected that it wasn't the first time something like this had occurred, and had to repress a laugh when she showed Izuku her more than capable wallet a few minutes after. The way the two bantered together was sometimes reminiscent of bickering siblings, getting on each other's nerves constantly but secretly enjoying the game all the while. Everything came crashing down around him, however, when 30 minutes into the movie the titular antagonist appeared. The film was apparently of the slasher variety, and the gruesome imagery began to hold far too many parallels to aspects of his own life to be ignored. Instead of staying put and enduring the scenes, Izuku eventually got up and left the room, taking a seat in the hall while waiting for his nausea to pass. The feeling was so overwhelming that he failed to notice when someone else sat down beside him. Sorry about that. All things considered, I didn't really think you'd be so sensitive to gore at this point. Izuku tilted his head up to see Toga seated beside him, a look of seemingly genuine concern on her face. Well, sorry wouldn't really cut it, but I guess this is probably my fault anyways. Izuku muttered, looking back at the sign above the door they had both exited. It was a horror movie after all. Toga reached out to put a hand on his shoulder but recoiled as she seemed to think better of it. Yeah, I know that everything's probably really got a SCK for you right now, huh, what with how you used to be and all. You always seemed like the really heroic type when I saw you with your class, but now you looked so different that I thought maybe you'd changed. I mean, all of us used to be kinda like you were at some point. Well, everyone that likes staying at least. Doing things that everyone else thinks are bad SCKs, even when you know you're doing it for the right reason. And I guess with what you've got going on you can't even say that much. Are you trying to make me feel better or worse? You might find it hard to believe. But better. I'm just trying to say that while your reality might not always be the best, there are probably still good things that you can do with it. Even I feel regret for things sometimes, but then I remember that I'm doing it to make the world a better place for people who rely on heroes by getting rid of the fakers. If you just find something to strive for too, then maybe you can forgive yourself for the bad things like the rest of us do. Or put them behind you at least, I guess. Toga stood back up and dusted herself off. Sorry if all that sounded painfully cheesy. I've got a movie to watch though, so I hope you'll be fine out here on your own. You look a little pale, so if you're not coming you might want to go outside and get some fresh air. With that said, the blonde teenager walked off back into the movie, her chipper attitude regained as soon as her feet hit the floor. Izuku thought back on what she'd said, though what kept echoing in his head were those last words. Go outside and get some fresh air. It was almost like an invitation to run away. He could exit the building, run somewhere safe, tip the police off to the villain's location and be done with the whole thing. Just as the thought hit him, his elbow brushed against his pocket, catching on the outline of the knife he always kept with him, and he knew he was wrong. He could never be done with the whole thing. No matter where he went he'd always have to kill, so he might as well do it for the right reasons. He stood up, took a deep breath, and followed the path Toga had taken moments before, back into the theater. Blood was just something he was going to have to get used to, so he might as well start now. Even after the movie was done and karaoke had once again been denied as a recreational option, Izuku still failed to see the figure which had been trailing the group since their departure as it diverged from their path. Kurojiiri had already seen enough to know that Izuku Midoriya had been given the chance to leave and hadn't, and that was enough. It seemed as though the boy might finally be ready for his much-awaited debut.